The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. A Whisper to the Reader. There is no character, howsoever good and fine, but it can be destroyed by ridicule, howsoever poor and witless. Observe the ass, for instance. His character is about perfect. He is the choicest spirit among all the humbler animals, yet see what ridicule has brought him to. Instead of feeling complimented when we are called an ass, we are left in doubt. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. A person who is ignorant of legal matters is always liable to make mistakes when he tries to photograph a court scene with his pen, and so I was not willing to let the law chapters in this book go to press without first subjecting them to rigid and exhausting revision and correction by a trained barrister, if that is what they are called. These chapters are right, now, in every detail, for they were rewritten under the immediate eye of William Hicks, who studied law part of a while in southwest Missouri 35 years ago, and then came over here to Florence for his health, and is still helping for exercise and board in Macaroni Vermicelli's horse-feed shed, which is up the back alley as you turn around the corner out of the Piazza del Duomo, just beyond the house where that stone that Dante used to sit on 600 years ago is let into the wall when he let on to be watching them build Giotto's Campanile, and yet always got tired looking as Beatrice passed along on her way to get a chunk of chestnut cake to defend herself with in case of a Ghibelline outbreak before she got to school, at the same old stand where they sell the same old cake to this day, and it is just as light and good as it was then, too. And this is not flattery, far from it. He was a little rusty on his law, but he rubbed up for this book, and those 2 or 3 legal chapters are right and straight now. He told me so himself. Given under my hand this 2nd day of January, 1893, at the Villa Viviani, village of Settignano, 3 miles back of Florence on the hills, the same certainly affording the most charming view to be found on this planet, and with it the most dreamlike and enchanting sunsets to be found in any planet or even in any solar system, and given, too, in the swell room of the house, with the busts of Seratani senators and other grandees of this line looking approvingly down upon me, as they used to look down upon Dante, and mutely asking me to adopt them into my family, which I do with pleasure, for my remotest ancestors are but spring chickens compared with these robed and stately antiques, and it will be a great and satisfying lift for me, that 600 years will. Mark Twain. End of A Whisper to the Reader. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. Chapter 1. Pudd'nhead Wins His Name. Tell the truth or trump, but get the trick. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. The scene of this chronicle is in the town of Dawson's Landing on the Missouri side of the Mississippi, half a day's journey per steamboat below St. Louis. In 1830 it was a snug collection of modest 1- and 2-story frame dwellings whose whitewashed exteriors were almost concealed from sight by climbing tangles of rose vines, honeysuckles, and morning glories. Each of these pretty homes had a garden in front fenced with white palings and opulently stocked with hollyhocks, marigolds, touch-me-nots, prince's feathers, and other old-fashioned flowers, while on the window-sills of the houses stood wooden boxes containing moss rose plants and terracotta pots in which grew a breed of geranium whose spread of intensely red blossoms accented the prevailing pink tint of the rose-clad house-front like an explosion of flame. When there was room on the ledge outside of the pots and boxes for a cat, the cat was there, in sunny weather, stretched at full length, asleep and blissful, with her furry belly to the sun, and a paw curved over her nose. Then that house was complete, and its contentment and peace were made manifest to the world by this symbol whose testimony is infallible. A home without a cat and a well-fed, well-petted, and properly revered cat may be a perfect home, perhaps, but how can it prove title? All along the streets on both sides, at the outer edge of the brick sidewalks, stood locust trees with trunks protected by wooden boxing, and these furnished shade for summer and a sweet fragrancer in spring when the clusters of buds came forth. The main street, 1 block back from the river and running parallel with it, was the sole business street. It was 6 blocks long, and in each block 2 or 3 brick stores, 3 stories high, towered above interjected bunches of little frame shops. Swinging signs creaked in the wind the street's whole length. The candy-striped pole, which indicates nobility proud and ancient along the palace-bordered canals of Venice, indicated merely the humble barber shop along the main street of Dawson's Landing. On a chief corner stood a lofty, unpainted pole wreathed from top to bottom with tin pots and pans and cups. The chief timmonger's noisy notice to the world, when the wind blew, that his shop was on hand for business at that corner. The hamlet's front was washed by the clear waters of the great river. Its body stretched itself rearward up a gentle incline. Its most rearward border fringed itself out and scattered its houses about its base line of the hills. The hills rose high, enclosing the town in a half-moon curve, clothed with forests from foot to summit. Steamboats passed up and down every hour or so. Those belonging to the little Cairo line and the little Memphis line always stopped. The big Orleans liners stopped for hails only, or to land passengers or freight, and this was the case also with the great flotilla of transients. These latter came out of a dozen rivers: the Illinois, the Missouri, the Upper Mississippi, the Ohio, the Monongahela, the Tennessee, the Red River, the White River, and so on, and were bound every whither and stocked with every imaginable comfort or necessity which the Mississippi's community could want, from the frosty falls of St. Anthony down through 9 climates to torrid New Orleans. Dawson's Landing was a slave-holding town with a rich slave-worked grain and pork country back of it. The town was sleepy and comfortable and contented. It was 50 years old and was growing slowly, very slowly, in fact, but still it was growing. The chief citizen was York Lester Driscoll, about 40 years old, judge of the county court. He was very proud of his old Virginian ancestry, and in his hospitalities, and his rather formal and stately manners. He kept up its traditions. He was fine and just and generous. To be a gentleman without stain or blemish, was his only religion, and to it he was always faithful. He was respected, esteemed, and beloved by all of the community. He was well off, and was gradually adding to his store. He and his wife were very nearly happy, but not quite, for they had no children. The longing for the treasure of a child had grown stronger and stronger as the years slipped away, but the blessing never came, and was never to come. With this pair lived the judge's widowed sister, Mrs. Rachel Pratt, and she also was childless and sorrowful for that reason, and not to be comforted. The women were good and commonplace people, and did their duty, and had their reward in clear consciences and the community's approbation. They were Presbyterians. The judge was a freethinker. Pembroke Howard, lawyer and bachelor, aged almost 40, was another old Virginian grandee with proved descent from the first families. He was a fine, majestic creature, a gentleman according to the nicest requirements of the Virginia rule, a devoted Presbyterian, an authority on the code, and a man always courteously ready to stand up before you in the field if any act or word of his had seemed doubtful or suspicious to you, and explain it with any weapon you might prefer, from brattles to artillery. He was very popular with the people, and was the judge's dearest friend. Then there was Colonel Cecil Burleigh Essex, another FFV of formidable caliber. However, with him we have no concern. Percy Northumberland Driscoll, brother to the judge, and younger than he by 5 years, was a married man, and had had children around his hearthstone, but they were attacked in detail by measles, croup, and scarlet fever, and this had given the doctor a chance with his effective antediluvian methods, so the cradles were empty. He was a prosperous man, with a good head for speculations, and his fortune was growing. On the 1st of February, 1830, 2 boy babes were born in his house, one to him and one to one of his slave girls, Roxana by name. Roxana was 20 years old. She was up and around the same day with her hands full, for she was tending both babes. Mrs. Percy Driscoll died within the week. Roxy remained in charge of the children. She had had her own way, for Mr. Driscoll soon absorbed himself in his speculations and left her to her own devices. In that same month of February, Dawson's Landing gained a new citizen. This was Mr. David Wilson, a young fellow of Scotch parentage. He had wandered to this remote region from his birthplace in the interior of the state of New York to seek his fortune. He was 25 years old, college-bred, and had finished a post-college course in an Eastern law school a couple of years before. He was a homely, freckled, sandy-haired young fellow with an intelligent blue eye that had frankness and comradeship in it and a covert twinkle of a pleasant sort. But for an unfortunate remark of his, he would no doubt have entered at once upon a successful career at Dawson's Landing. But he made his fatal remark the first day he spent in the village, and it gauged him. He had just made the acquaintance of a group of citizens when an invisible dog began to yelp and snarl and howl and make himself very comprehensively disagreeable, whereupon young Wilson said, much as one who is thinking aloud, "I wish I owned half of that dog." "Why?" somebody asked. "Because I would kill my half." The group searched his face with curiosity, with anxiety even, but found no light there, no expression that they could read. They fell away from him as from something uncanny, and went into privacy to discuss him. One said, "'Pears to be a fool." "'Pears," said another. "Is, I reckon you better say." "Said he wished to own half of the dog, the idiot," said the third. "What did he reckon would become of the other half if he killed his half? Do you reckon he thought it would live?" "Why, he must have thought it, unless he is the downrightest fool in the world, because if he hadn't thought it, he would have wanted to own the whole dog, knowing that if he killed his half, the other half died. He would be responsible for that half just the same as if he'd killed that half instead of his own. Don't it look that way to you, gents?" "Yes, it does. If he owned one half of the general dog, it would be so. If he owned one end of the dog and another person owned the other end, it would be so, just the same, particularly in the first case, because if you kill one half of a general dog, there ain't any man that can tell whose half it was. But if he owned one end of the dog, maybe he could kill his end of it and— No, he couldn't either. He couldn't and not be responsible if the other end died, which it would. In my opinion, that man ain't in his right mind." "In my opinion, he ain't got any mind." Number 3 said, "Well, he's a lummox, anyway." "Well, that's what he is," said Number 4. "He's a laybrick, just a Simon Pure laybrick, if there was one." "Yes, sir, he's a damn fool. That's the way I put him up," said Number 5. "Anybody can think different that wants to, but those are my sentiments."
"I'm with you, gentlemen," said Number 6. "Perfect jackass. Yes, and he ain't going too far to say he is a puddin'-head. If he ain't a puddin'-head, I ain't no judge, that's all."
Mr. Wilson stood elected. The incident was told all over the town and gravely discussed by everybody. Within a week he had lost his first name. Pudd'nhead took its place. In time he came to be liked, and well liked, too, but by that time the nickname had got well stuck on, and it stayed. That first day's verdict made him a fool, and he was not able to get it set aside or even modified. The nickname soon ceased to carry any harsh or unfriendly feeling with it, but it held its place, and was to continue to hold its place for 20 long years. End of Chapter 1. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. Chapter 2. Driscoll Spares His Slaves. Adam was human. This explains it all. He did not want the apple for the apple's sake. He wanted it only because it was forbidden. The mistake was in not forbidding the serpent. Then he would have eaten the serpent. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. Pudd'nhead Wilson had a trifle of money when he arrived, and he bought a small house on the extreme western verge of the town. Between it and Judge Driscoll's house there was only a grassy yard, with a paling fence dividing the properties in the middle. He hired a small office down in the town and hung out a tin sign with these words on it: David Wilson, attorney and counselor at law, surveying, conveyancing, etc. But his deadly remark had ruined his chance, at least in the law. No clients came. He took down his sign, after a while, and put it up on his own house, with the law features knocked out of it. It offered his services now in the humble capacities of land surveyor and expert accountant. Now and then he got a job of surveying to do, and now and then a merchant got him to straighten out his books. With Scotch patience and pluck he resolved to live down his reputation and work his way into the legal field yet. Poor fellow, he could foresee that it was going to take him such a weary long time to do it. He had a rich abundance of idle time, but it never hung heavy on his hands, for he interested himself in every new thing that was born into the universe of ideas, and studied it and experimented upon it at his house. One of his pet fads was palmistry. To another one he gave no name, neither would he explain to anybody what its purpose was, but merely said it was an amusement. In fact, he had found that his fads added to his reputation as a pudd'nhead. There, he was growing chary of being too communicative about them. The fad without a name was one which dealt with people's finger marks. He carried in his coat pocket a shallow box with grooves in it, and in the grooves strips of glass 5 inches long and 3 inches wide. Along the lower edge of each strip was pasted a slip of white paper. He asked people to pass their hands through their hair, thus collecting upon them a thin coating of the natural oil, and then making a thumb mark on a glass strip, following it with the mark of the ball of each finger in succession. Under this row of faint grease prints he would write a record on the strip of white paper, thus: John Smith, right hand, and add the day of the month and the year, then take Smith's left hand on another glass strip, and add name and date and the words left hand. The strips were now returned to the grooved box, and took their place among what Wilson called his records. He often studied his records, examining and poring over them with absorbing interest until far into the night. But what he found there, if he found anything, he revealed to no one. Sometimes he copied on paper the involved and delicate pattern left by the ball of the finger, and then vastly enlarged it with a pantograph, so that he could examine its web of curving lines with ease and convenience. One sweltering afternoon, it was the first day of July, 1830, he was at work over a set of tangled account books in his workroom, which looked westward over a stretch of vacant lots, when a conversation outside disturbed him. It was carried on in yells, which showed that the people engaged in it were not close together.
"Say, Roxy, how does your baby come on?"
This from the distant voice.
"First rate. How does you come on, Jasper?"
This yell was from close by.
"Oh, I's middlin'. Ain't got nothing to complain of. I's gwine to come a-courtin' you by, Roxy."
"You is, you black mudcat? Yeah. I got something better to do than to associating with niggers as black as you is. Is old Miss Cooper's Nancy done give you the mitten?"
Roxy followed this sally with another discharge of carefree laughter.
"You's jealous, Roxy. That's what's the matter with you, you hussy. Yeah. That's the time I got you."
"Oh, yes, you got me, hain't you? 'Clah to goodness, if that conceit of yourn strikes in, Jasper, it gwine to kill you sure. If you belonged to me, I'd sell you down the river 'fore you get too far gone. First time I runs across you, master, I's gwine to tell him so."
This idle and aimless jabber went on and on, both parties enjoying the friendly duel, and each well satisfied with his own share of the wit exchanged. For wit they considered it. Wilson stepped to the window to observe the combatants. He could not work while their chatter continued. Over in the vacant lots was Jasper, young, coal-black, and of magnificent build, sitting on a wheelbarrow in the pelting sun, at work, supposedly, whereas he was in fact only preparing for it by taking an hour's rest before beginning. In front of Wilson's porch stood Roxy, with a local handmade baby wagon, in which sat her 2 charges, one at each end and facing each other. From Roxy's manner of speech, a stranger would have expected her to be black, but she was not. Only 1/16 of her was black, and that 16th did not show. She was of majestic form and stature. Her attitudes were imposing and statuesque, and her gestures and movements distinguished by a noble and stately grace. Her complexion was very fair, with a rosy glow of vigorous health in her cheeks. Her face was full of character and expression. Her eyes were brown and liquid, and she had a heavy suit of fine, soft hair, which was also brown. But the fact was not apparent because her head was bound about with a checkered handkerchief, and the hair was concealed under it. Her face was shapely, intelligent, and comely, even beautiful. She had an easy, independent carriage when she was among her own caste, and a high and sassy way withal, but of course she was meek and humble enough where white folk were. To all intents and purposes, Roxy was as white as anybody, but the 1/16 of her, which was black, outvoted the other 15 parts and made her a Negro. She was a slave, and saleable as such. Her child was 31 parts white, and he, too, was a slave, and, by a fiction of law and custom, a Negro. He had blue eyes and flaxen curls like his white comrade, but even the father of the white child was able to tell the children apart, little as he had commerce with them, by their clothes, for the white babe wore ruffled soft muslin and a coral necklace, while the other wore merely a coarse tow-linen shirt which barely reached to his knees, and no jewelry. The white child's name was Thomas Beckard Driscoll. The other's name was valet de chambre, no surname. Slaves hadn't the privilege. Roxana had heard that phrase somewhere. The fine sound of it had pleased her ear, and as she had supposed it was a name, she loaded it on to her darling. It soon got shortened to Chambers, of course. Wilson knew Roxy by sight, and when the duel of wits begun to play out, he stepped outside to gather in a record or 2. Jasper went to work energetically at once, perceiving that his leisure was observed. Wilson inspected the children and asked, "How old are they, Roxy?"
"Both the same age, sir. 5 months. Born the 1st of February."
"They're handsome little chaps. One's just as handsome as the other, too." A delighted smile exposed the girl's white teeth, and she said,
"Bless your soul, Mr. Wilson, it's powerful nice of you to say that, 'cause one of them ain't only a nigger. Mighty prime little nigger, I always says, but that's 'cause it's mine, of course."
"How do you tell them apart, Roxy, when they haven't any clothes on?" Roxy laughed a laugh proportionate to her size, and said,
"Oh, I can tell 'em apart, Mr. Wilson, but I bet Mars Percy couldn't, not to save his life."
Wilson chatted along for a while, and presently got Roxy's fingerprints for his collection, right hand and left, on a couple of his glass strips, then labeled and dated them, and took the records of both children and labeled and dated them also. 2 months later, on the 3rd of September, he took this trio of finger marks again. He liked to have a series, 2 or 3 takings at intervals during the period of childhood, there to be followed at intervals of several years. The next day, that is to say on the 4th of September, something occurred which profoundly impressed Roxana. Mr. Driscoll missed another small sum of money, which is a way of saying that this was not a new thing, but had happened before. In truth, it had happened 3 times before. Driscoll's patience was exhausted. He was a fairly humane man toward slaves and other animals. He was an exceedingly humane man toward the erring of his own race. Theft he could not abide, and plainly there was a thief in his house. Necessarily the thief must be one of his negroes. Sharp measures must be taken. He called his servants before him. There were 3 of these, besides Roxy, a man, a woman, and a boy 12 years old. They were not related. Mr. Driscoll said, "You have all been warned before. It has done no good. This time I will teach you a lesson. I will sell the thief. Which of you is the guilty one?" They all shuddered at the threat, for here they had a good home, and a new one was likely to be a change for the worse. The denial was general. None had stolen anything, not money, anyway, a little sugar or cake or honey or something like that Marse Percy wouldn't mind or miss, but not money, never a cent of money. They were eloquent in their protestations, but Mr. Driscoll was not moved by them. He answered each in turn with a stern, "Name the thief." The truth was, all were guilty but Roxana. She suspected that the others were guilty, but she did not know them to be so. She was horrified to think how near she had come to being guilty herself. She had been saved in the nick of time by a revival in the colored Methodist Church a fortnight before, at which time and place she got religion. The very next day after that gracious experience, while her change of style was fresh upon her, and she was vain of her purified condition, her master left a couple of dollars unprotected on his desk, and she happened upon that temptation when she was polishing around with a dust-rag. She looked at the money a while with a steady rising resentment, then she burst out with,
"Dad blame that revival! I wished it had been put off till tomorrow."
Then she covered the tempter with a book, and another member of the kitchen cabinet got it. She made this sacrifice as a matter of religious etiquette, as a thing necessary just now, but by no means to be wrested into a precedent. No, a week or two would limber up her piety. Then she would be rational again, and the next $2 that got left out in the cold would find a comforter, and she could name the comforter. Was she bad? Was she worse than the general run of her race? No. They had an unfair show in the battle of life, and they held it no sin to take military advantage of the enemy in a small way, but not in a large one. They would smooch provisions from the pantry whenever they got a chance, or a brass thimble, or a cake of wax, or an emery bag, or a paper of needles, or a silver spoon, or a dollar bill, or small articles of clothing, or any other property of light value, and so far were they from considering such reprisals sinful that they would go to church and shout and pray the loudest and sincerest with their plunder in their pockets. A farm smokehouse had to be kept heavily padlocked, or even the colored deacon himself could not resist a ham when Providence showed him in a dream, or otherwise, where such a thing hung lonesome and longed for someone to love. But with 100 hanging before him, the deacon would not take two, that is, on the same night. On frosty nights the humane negro prowler would warm the end of the plank and put it under the cold claws of chickens roosting in a tree. A drowsy hen would step onto the comfortable board, softly clucking her gratitude, and the prowler would dump her into his bag and later into his stomach, perfectly sure that in taking this trifle from the man who daily robbed him of an inestimable treasure, his liberty, he was not committing any sin that God would remember against him in the last great day. Name the thief! For the 4th time Mr. Driscoll had said it, and always in the same hard tone. And now he added these words of awful import. "I give you 1 minute." He took out his watch. "If, at the end of that time, you have not confessed, I will not only sell all 4 of you, but I will sell you down the river." It was equivalent to condemning them to hell. No Missouri negro doubted this. Roxy reeled in her tracks, and the color vanished out of her face. The others dropped to their knees as if they had been shot. Tears gushed from their eyes. Their supplicating hands went up, and 3 answers came in the one instant.
"I done it!
I done it!
I done it! Have mercy, master! Lord have mercy on us poor niggers!"
"Very good," said the master, putting up his watch. "I will sell you here, though you don't deserve it. You ought to be sold down the river." The culprits flung themselves prone in an ecstasy of gratitude and kissed his feet, declaring that they would never forget his goodness and never cease to pray for him as long as they lived. They were sincere, for like a god he had stretched forth his mighty hand and closed the gates of hell against them. He knew himself that he had done a noble and gracious thing, and was privately well pleased with his magnanimity. And that night he set the incident down in his diary, so that his son might read it in after years and be thereby moved to deeds of gentleness and humanity himself. End of Chapter 2. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. Chapter 3. Roxy Plays a Shrewd Trick. Whoever has lived long enough to find out what life is knows how deep a debt of gratitude we owe to Adam, the first great benefactor of our race. He brought death into the world. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. Percy Driscoll slept well the night he saved his house minions from going down the river, but no wink of sleep visited Roxy's eyes. A profound terror had taken possession of her. Her child could grow up and be sold down the river. The thought crazed her with horror. If she dozed and lost herself for a moment, the next moment she was on her feet flying to her child's cradle to see if it was still there. Then she would gather it to her heart and pour out her love upon it in a frenzy of kisses, moaning, crying, and saying, "They shan't, oh, they shan't! Your poor mammy will kill you first." Once, when she was tucking him back in its cradle again, the other child nestled in its sleep and attracted her attention. She went and stood over it a long time, communing with herself.
"What has my poor baby done that he couldn't have your luck? He ain't done nothing. God was good to you. Why warn't he good to him? They can't sell you down the river. I hates your pappy. He ain't got no heart. For niggers he ain't, anyways. I hates him, and I could kill him."
She paused a while, thinking. Then she burst into wild sobbings again, and turned away, saying,
"Oh, I got to kill my child. Ain't no other way. Killing him wouldn't get the child from going down the river. Oh, I got to do it. Your poor mammy's got to kill you to save you, honey."
She gathered her baby to her bosom now, and began to smother it with caresses.
"Mammy's got to kill you. How can I do it? But your mammy ain't going to desert you. No, don't cry. She gwine with you. She gwine to kill herself, too. Come along, honey. Come along with mammy. We gwine to jump in the river. Then troubles this world is all over. They don't sell poor niggers down the river over yonder."
She stared toward the door, crooning to the child and hushing it. Midway she stopped suddenly. She had caught a sight of her new Sunday gown, a cheap curtain calico thing, a conflagration of gaudy colors and fantastic figures. She surveyed it wistfully, longingly.
"Ain't ever worn it yet," she said, "and it's just lovely."
Then she nodded her head in response to a pleasant idea and added,
"No, I ain't going to be fished out, with everybody looking at me in this miserable old linsey-woolsey."
She put down the child and made the change. She looked in the glass and was astonished at her beauty. She resolved to make her death toilet perfect. She took off her handkerchief turban and dressed her glossy wealth of hair like white folks. She added some odds and ends of rather lurid ribbon and a spray of atrocious artificial flowers. Finally, she threw over her shoulders a fluffy thing called a cloud in that day, which was of a blazing red complexion. Then she was ready for the tomb. She gathered up her baby once more, but when her eye fell upon its miserably short little gray tow-linen shirt and noted the contrast between its pauper shabbiness and her own volcanic eruption of infernal splendors, her mother heart was touched, and she was ashamed.
"No, doling mammy ain't gwine to treat you so. The angels is gwine to admire you just as much as they does your mammy. Ain't gwine to have them putting their hands up for their eyes and saying to David and Goliath and them other prophets, 'That child is dressed too indelicate for this place.'"
By this time she had stripped off the shirt. Now she clothed the naked little creature in one of Thomas à Becket's snowy long baby gowns, with its bright blue bows and dainty flummery of ruffles.
"Dar, now you's fixed."
She propped the child in a chair and stood off to inspect it. Straightway her eyes began to widen with astonishment and admiration, and she clapped her hands and cried out,
"Why, it do beat all. I never knowed you was so lovely. Marse Tommy ain't a bit purtier, not a single bit."
She stepped over and glanced at the other infant. She flung a glance back at her own, then one more at the heir of the house. Now a strange light dawned in her eyes, and in a moment she was lost in thought. She seemed in a trance when she came out of it. She muttered,
"When I was washing him in the tub yesterday, he own pappy asked me which of 'em was his'n."
She began to move around like one in a dream. She undressed Thomas à Becket, stripping him of everything, and put the tow-linen shirt on him. She put his coral necklace on her own child's neck. Then she placed the children side by side, and after earnest inspection she muttered,
"Now who would believe clothes could do the like of that? Dog my cats if it ain't all I can do to tell t'other from which, let alone his pappy."
She put her cub in Tommy's elegant cradle and said,
"You's young Mars Tom from dis out, and I got to practice and git used to 'memberin' to call you dat, honey, or I's gwine to make a mistake sometime and git us both into trouble. Dah, now you lay still and don't fret no more, Mars Tom. Oh, thank the Lord in heaven, you's saved, you's saved. There ain't no man can ever sell Mammy's poor little honey down the river now."
She put the heir of the house in her own child's unpainted pine cradle, and said, contemplating its slumbering form uneasily,
"I's sorry for you, honey. I's sorry, God knows I is, but what kin I do? What could I do? Your pappy would sell him to somebody sometime, and then he'd go down the river, sho, and I couldn't stand it."
She flung herself on her bed and began to think and toss and think. By and by she sat suddenly upright, for a comforting thought had flown through her worried mind.
"'Tain't no sin. White folks has done it. It ain't no sin. Glory to goodness, it ain't no sin. Dey's done it. Yes, and dey was the biggest quality in the whole billin', too. Kings."
She began to muse. She was trying to gather out of her memory the dim particulars of some tale she had heard some time or other. At last she said,
"Now I's got it. Now I 'member. It was dat old nigger preacher dat told it, the time he come over here from Illinois and preached in the nigger church. He said they ain't nobody can save his own self, can't do it by faith, can't do it by works, can't do it no way 't all. Free grace is the only way, and that don't come from nobody but jes' the Lord, and he can give it to anybody he please, saint or sinner. He don't care. He do just as he's a minder. He select out anybody to suit him, and put another one in his place, and make the first one happy forever, and leave t'other one to burn with Satan. The preacher said it was just like they done in England one time, long time ago. The queen, she left her baby layin' round one day, and went out callin', and one of the niggers round about the place that was most white, she come in and see the child layin' round, and took and put her own child's clothes on the queen's child, and put the queen's child's clothes on her own child, and then left her own child layin' round, and took and toted the queen's child home to the nigger quarter, and nobody ever found it out, and her child was the king by, and sold the queen's child down the river one time when they had to settle up the estate. Dar now, the preacher said it his own self, and it ain't no sin, 'case white folks done it. Dey done it, yes, dey done it. Not only just common white folks, nether, but the biggest quality dey is in the whole billin'. Oh, I's so glad I 'member 'bout that."
She got light-hearted and happy, and went to the cradles, and spent what was left of the night practicing. She would give her own child a light pat and say humbly, "Lay still, Mars Tom," then give the real Tom a pat and say with severity, "Lay still, Chambers. Does you want me to take something to you?" As she progressed with her practice, she was surprised to see how steadily and surely the awe which had kept her tongue reverent and her manner humble toward her young master was transferring itself to her speech and manner toward the usurper, and how similarly handy she was becoming in transferring her motherly curtness of speech and peremptoriness of manner to the unlucky heir of the ancient house of Driscoll. She took occasional rests from practicing, and absorbed herself in calculating her chances.
"They'll sell these niggers to-day for stealin' the money, then they'll buy some more that don't know the children, so that's all right. When I takes the children out to get the air, the minute I's round the corner, I's gwine to gwam dey's mouths all round with jam, then they can't nobody notice they's changed. Yes, I gwine to do dat till I's safe, if it's a year. Dey ain't but one man dat I's feared of, and that's dat Pudd'nhead Wilson. Dey calls him a pudd'nhead, and says he's a fool. My land, dat man ain't no more fool than I is. He's the smartest man in this town, less'n it's Judge Driscoll or maybe Pem Howard. Blame dat man, he worries me with dem ornery glasses of his'n. I believe he's a witch. But never mind. I's gwine to happen round there one of these days, and let on that I reckon he wants to print a chillen's fingers agin, and if he don't notice they's changed, I bound they ain't nobody gwine to notice it, and then I's safe, sho. but I reckon I'll tote along a horseshoe to keep off the witch-work."
The new negroes gave Roxy no trouble, of course. The master gave her none, for one of his speculations was in jeopardy, and his mind was so occupied that he hardly saw the children when he looked at them, and all Roxy had to do was to get them both into a gale of laughter when he came about. Then their faces were mainly cavities exposing gums, and he was gone again before the spasm passed and the little creatures resumed a human aspect. Within a few days the fate of the speculation became so dubious that Mr. Percy went away with his brother, the judge, to see what could be done with it. It was a land speculation, as usual, and it had gotten complicated with a lawsuit. The men were gone 7 weeks. Before they got back, Roxy had paid her visit to Wilson and was satisfied. Wilson took the fingerprints, labeled them with the names and with the date, October the 1st, put them carefully away, and continued his chat with Roxy, who seemed very anxious that he should admire the great advance in flesh and beauty which the babes had made since he took their fingerprints a month before. He complimented their improvement to her contentment, and as they were without any disguise of jam or other stain, she trembled all the while and was miserably frightened lest at any moment But he didn't. He discovered nothing, and she went home jubilant, and dropped all concern about the matter permanently out of her mind. End of Chapter 3. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson, by Mark Twain, Chapter 4, The Ways of the Changelings. Adam and Eve had many advantages, but the principal one was that they escaped teething. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. There is this trouble about special providences. Namely, there is so often a doubt as to which party was intended to be the beneficiary. In the case of the children, the bears, and the prophet, the bears got more real satisfaction out of the episode than the prophet did, because they got the children. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar.
This history must henceforth accommodate itself to the change which Roxana has consummated, and call the real heirs Chambers, and the usurping little slave Thomas à Becket, shortening this latter name to Tom for daily use, as the people about him did. Tom was a bad baby from the very beginning of his usurpation. He would cry for nothing. He would burst into storms of devilish temper without notice, and let go scream after scream and squall after squall, then climax the thing with holding his breath, that frightful specialty of the teething nursling, in the throes of which the creature exhausts its lungs, then is convulsed with noiseless squirmings and twistings and kickings in the effort to get its breath, while the lips turn blue and the mouth stands wide and rigid, offering for inspection one wee tooth set in the lower rim of a hoop of red gums. And when the appalling stillness has endured until one is sure the lost breath will never return, a nurse comes flying and dashes water in the child's face, and presto, the lungs fill, and instantly discharge a shriek or a yell or a howl which bursts the listening ear and surprises the owner of it into saying words which would not go well with a halo if he had one. The baby Tom would claw anybody who came within reach of his nails, and pound anybody he could reach with his rattle. He would scream for water until he got it, and then throw cup and all on the floor and scream for more. He was indulged in all his caprices, however so troublesome and exasperating they might be. He was allowed to eat anything he wanted, particularly things that would give him the stomach-ache. When he got to be old enough to begin to toddle about and say broken words and get an idea of what his hands were for, he was a more consummate pest than ever. Roxy got no rest while he was awake. He would call for anything and everything he saw, simply saying, "Want it," which was a command. When it was brought, he said in a frenzy, and motioning it away with his hands, "Don't want it! Don't want it!" And the moment it was gone, he set up frantic yells of "Want it! Want it!" And Roxy had to give wings to her heels to get that thing back to him again before he could get time to carry out his intention of going into convulsions about it. What he preferred above all other things was the tongs. This was because his father had forbidden him to have them lest he break windows and furniture with them. The moment Roxy's back was turned,
he would toddle to the presence of the tongs and say, "Like it," and cock his eye to one side or see if Roxy was observed. Then, "Aunt it," and cock his eye again. Then, "Have it," with another furtive glance, and finally, "Take it," and the prize was his. The next moment the heavy implement was raised aloft, the next there was a crash and a squall, and the cat was off on 3 legs to meet an engagement. Roxy would arrive just as the lamp or a window went to irremediable smash. Tom got all the petting, Chambers got none. Tom got all the delicacies, Chambers got mush and milk and clabber without sugar. In consequence, Tom was a sickly child, and Chambers wasn't. Tom was fractious, as Roxy called it, and overbearing. Chambers was meek and docile. With all her splendid common sense and practical everyday ability, Roxy was a doting fool of a mother. She was this toward her child, and she was also more than this. By the fiction created by herself, he was become her master. The necessity of recognizing this relation outwardly, and of perfecting herself in the forms required to express the recognition, had moved her to such diligence and faithfulness in practicing these forms that this exercise soon concreted itself into habit. It became automatic and unconscious. Then a natural result followed. Deceptions intended solely for others gradually grew practically into self-deceptions as well. The mock reverence became real reverence, the mock homage real homage. The little counterfeit rift of separation between imitation slave and imitation master widened and became an abyss, and a very real one, and on one side of it stood Roxy, the dupe of her own deceptions, and on the other stood her child, no longer a usurper to her, but her accepted and recognized master. He was her darling, her master, and her deity all in one, and in her worship of him she forgot who she was and what he had been. In babyhood Tom cuffed and banged and scratched Chambers unrebuked, and Chambers early learned that between meekly bearing it and resenting it, the advantage all lay with the former policy. The few times that his persecutions had moved him beyond control and made him fight back had cost him very dear at headquarters, not at the hands of Roxy, for if she ever went beyond scolding him sharply for forgetting who his young master was, she at least never extended her punishment beyond a box on the ear. No, Percy Driscoll was the person. He told Chambers that under no provocation whatever was he privileged to lift his hand against his little master. Chambers overstepped the line 3 times, and got 3 such convincing canings from the man who was his father, and didn't know it, that he took Tom's cruelties in all humility after that, and made no more experiments. Outside the house the 2 boys were together all through their boyhood. Chambers was strong beyond his years, and a good fighter. Strong because he was coarsely fed and hard worked about the house, and a good fighter because Tom furnished him plenty of practice on white boys whom he hated and was afraid of. Chambers was his constant bodyguard, to and from school. He was present on the playground at recess to protect his charge. He fought himself into such formidable reputation by and by that Tom could have changed clothes with him and ridden in peace, like Sir Kay in Lancelot's armor. He was good at games of skill, too. Tom staked him with marbles to play keeps with, and then took all the winnings away from him. In the winter season Chambers was on hand in Tom's worn-out clothes with holy red mittens and holy shoes and pants holy at the knees and seat, to drag a sled up the hill for Tom, warmly clad, to ride down on, but he never got a ride himself. He built snowmen and snow fortifications under Tom's directions. He was Tom's patient target when Tom wanted to do some snowballing, but the target couldn't fire back. Chambers carried Tom's skates to the river and strapped them on him, then trotted around after him on the ice so as to be on hand when he wanted. But he wasn't ever asked to try the skates himself. In summer the pet pastime of the boys of Dawson's Landing was to steal apples, peaches, and melons from the farmers' fruit wagons, mainly on account of the risk they ran of getting their heads laid open with the butt of the farmer's whip. Tom was a distinguished adept at these thefts by proxy. Chambers did his stealing, and got the peach stones, apple cores, and melon rinds for his share. Tom always made Chambers go in swimming with him and stay by him as a protection. When Tom had had enough, he would slip out and tie knots in Chambers' shirt, dip the knots in the water, and make them hard to undo, then dress himself and sit by and laugh while the naked shiverer tugged at the stubborn knots with his teeth. Tom did his humble comrade these various ill turns partly out of native viciousness, and partly because he hated him for his superiorities of physique and pluck, and for his manifold cleverness. Tom couldn't dive, for it gave him splitting headaches. Chambers could dive without inconvenience, and was fond of doing it. He excited so much admiration, one day, among a crowd of white boys, by throwing back somersaults from the stern of a canoe, that it wearied Tom's spirit, and at last he shoved the canoe underneath Chambers while he was in the air, so he came down on his head in the canoe bottom. And while he lay unconscious, several of Tom's ancient adversaries saw that their long-desired opportunity was come, and they gave the false heir such a drubbing that with Chambers' best help he was hardly able to drag himself home afterward. When the boys was 15 and upward, Tom was showing off in the river one day when he was taken with a cramp and shouted for help. It was a common trick with the boys, particularly if a stranger was present, to pretend a cramp and howl for help. Then, when the stranger came tearing hand over hand to the rescue, the howler would go on struggling and howling till he was close at hand, then replace the howl with a sarcastic smile and swim blandly away, while the town boys assailed the dupe with a volley of jeers and laughter. Tom had never tried this joke as yet, but was supposed to be trying it now, so the boys held warily back. But Chambers believed his master was in earnest. Therefore he swam out and arrived in time, unfortunately, and saved his life. This was the last feather. Tom had managed to endure everything else, but to have to remain publicly and permanently under such an obligation as this to a nigger, and to this nigger of all niggers, this was too much. He heaped insults upon Chambers for pretending to think he was in earnest in calling for help, and said that anybody but a block-headed nigger would have known he was funning and left him alone. Tom's enemies were in strong force here, so they came out with their opinions quite freely. They laughed at him, and called him coward, liar, sneak, and other sorts of pet names, and told him they meant to call Chambers by a new name after this, and make it common in the town, Tom Driscoll's nigger pappy, to signify that he had had a second birth into his life, and that Chambers was the author of his new being. Tom grew frantic under these taunts, and shouted, "Knock their heads off, Chambers! Knock their heads off! What do you stand there with your hands in your pockets for?" Chambers expostulated and said, "But, Mars Tom, dey's too many of dem. Dey's— do you hear me? Please, Mars Tom, don't make me. Dey's so many of dem that—" Tom sprang at him and drove his pocket-knife into him 2 or 3 times before the boys could snatch him away and give the wounded lad a chance to escape. He was considerably hurt, but not seriously. If the blade had been a little longer, his career would have ended there. Tom had long ago taught Roxy her place. It had been many a day now since she had ventured a caress or a fondling epithet in his quarter. Such things from a nigger were repulsive to him, and she had been warned to keep her distance and remember who she was. She saw her darling gradually cease from being her son. She saw that detail perish utterly. All that was left was master. Master, pure and simple, and it was not a gentle mastership either. She saw herself sink from the sublime height of motherhood to the somber depths of unmodified slavery. The abyss of separation between her and her boy was complete. She was merely his chattel now, his convenience, his dog, his cringing and helpless slave, the humble and unresisting victim of his capricious temper and vicious nature. Sometimes she could not go to sleep, even when worn out with fatigue, because her rage boiled so high over the day's experiences with her boy. She would mumble and mutter to herself, "He struck me, and I warn't no way to blame. Struck me in the face, right before folks. And he's allus calling me nigger wench and hussy and all them mean names, when I's doing the very best I can. Oh, Lord, I done so much for him. I lift him away up to what he is,
and this is what I get for it."
Sometimes, when some outrage of peculiar offensiveness stung her to the heart, she would plan schemes of vengeance and revel in the fancied spectacle of his exposure to the world as an impostor and a slave. But in the midst of these joys fear would strike her. She had made him too strong. She could prove nothing, and, heavens, she might get sold down the river for her pains. So her schemes always went for nothing, and she laid them aside in an impotent rage against the fates, and against herself for playing the fool on that fatal September day in not providing herself with a witness for use in the day when such a thing might be needed for the appeasing of her vengeance-hungry heart. And yet, the moment Tom happened to be good to her and kind, and this occurred every now and then, all her sore places were healed and she was happy. Happy and proud, for this was her son, her nigger son, lording it among the whites and securely avenging their crimes against her race. There were 2 grand funerals in Dawson's Landing that fall, the fall of 1845. One was that of Colonel Cecil Burleigh Essex, the other that of Percy Driscoll. On his deathbed, Driscoll set Roxy free and delivered his idolized ostensible son solemnly into the keeping of his brother, the judge, and his wife. Those childless people were glad to get him. Childless people are not difficult to please. Judge Driscoll had gone privately to his brother a month before and bought Chambers. He had heard that Tom had been trying to get his father to sell the boy down the river, and he wanted to prevent the scandal, for public sentiment did not approve of that way of treating family servants for light cause or for no cause. Percy Driscoll had worn himself out in trying to save his great speculative landed estate, and had died without succeeding. He was hardly in his grave before the boom collapsed and left his envied young devil of an heir a pauper. But that was nothing. His uncle told him he should be his heir, and have all his fortune when he died, so Tom was comforted. Roxy had no home now, so she resolved to go around and say good-bye to her friends, and then clear out and see the world. That is to say, she would go chambermaiding on a steamboat, the darling ambition of her race and sex. Her last call was on the black giant Jasper. She found him chopping Pudd'nhead Wilson's winter provision of wood. Wilson was chatting with him when Roxy arrived. He asked her how she could bear to go off chambermaiding and leave her boys, and chaffingly offered to copy off a series of their fingerprints, reaching up to their 12th year, for her to remember them by. But she sobered in a moment, wondering if he suspected anything. Then she said she believed she didn't want them. Wilson said to himself, "The drop of black blood in her is superstitious. She thinks there's some devilry, some witch business about my glass mystery somewhere. She used to come here with an old horseshoe in her hand. It could have been an accident, but I doubt it." End of chapter 4. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. Chapter 5. The Twins Thrill Dawson's Landing. Training is everything. The peach was once a bitter almond. Cauliflower is nothing but cabbage with a college education. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. Remark of Dr. Baldwin's concerning upstarts. We don't care to eat toadstools that think they are truffles. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. Mrs. York Driscoll enjoyed 2 years of bliss with that prize, Tom, bliss that was troubled a little at times, it is true, but bliss nevertheless. Then she died, and her husband and his childless sister, Mrs. Pratt, continued this bliss business at the old stand. Tom was petted and indulged and spoiled to his entire content, or nearly that. This went on till he was 19. Then he was sent to Yale. He went handsomely equipped with conditions, but otherwise he was not an object of distinction there. He remained at Yale 2 years, and then threw up the struggle. He came home with his manners a good deal improved. He had lost his surliness and brusqueness, and was rather pleasantly soft and smooth now. He was furtively and sometimes openly ironical of speech, and given to gently touching people on the raw, but he did it with a good-natured, semi-conscious air that carried it off safely and kept him from getting into trouble. He was as indolent as ever, and showed no very strenuous desire to hunt up an occupation. People argued from this that he preferred to be supported by his uncle until his uncle's shoes should become vacant. He brought back one or two new habits with him, one of which he rather openly practiced, tippling, but concealed another, which was gambling. It would not do to gamble where his uncle could hear of it. He knew that quite well. Tom's Eastern polish was not popular among the young people. They could have endured it, perhaps, if Tom had stopped there, but he wore gloves, and that they couldn't stand and wouldn't. So he was mainly without society. He brought home with him a suit of clothes of such exquisite style and cut and fashion, Eastern fashion, city fashion, that it filled everybody with anguish, and was regarded as a peculiarly wanton affront. He enjoyed the feeling which he was exciting, and paraded the town serene and happy all day. But the young fellows set a tailor to work that night, and when Tom started out on his parade next morning, he found the old deformed negro bell-ringer straddling along in his wake, tricked out in a flamboyant curtain-calico exaggeration of his finery, and imitating his fancy Eastern graces as well as he could. Tom surrendered, and after that clothed himself in the local fashion. But the dull country town was tiresome to him, since his acquaintanceship with livelier regions, and it grew daily more and more so. He began to make little trips to St. Louis for refreshment. There he found companionship to suit him, and pleasures to his taste, along with more freedom, in some particulars, than he could have at home. So, during the next 2 years, his visits to the city grew in frequency, and his tarryings there grew steadily longer in duration. He was getting into deep waters. He was taking chances, privately, which might get him into trouble some day. In fact, did. Judge Driscoll had retired from the bench and from all business activities in 1850, and had now been comfortably idle 3 years. He was president of the Freethinkers Society, and Pudd'nhead Wilson was the other member. The society's weekly discussions were now the old lawyer's main interest in life. Pudd'nhead was still toiling in obscurity at the bottom of the ladder, under the blight of that unlucky remark which he had let fall 23 years before about the dog. Judge Driscoll was his friend, and claimed that he had a mind above the average, but that was regarded as one of the judge's whims, and it failed to modify the public opinion. Or rather, that was one of the reasons why it failed, but there was another and better one. If the judge had stopped with bare assertion, it would have had a good deal of effect. But he made the mistake of trying to prove his position. For some years Wilson had been privately at work on a whimsical almanac for his amusement, a calendar with a little dab of ostensible philosophy, usually in ironical form, appended to each date, and the judge thought that these quips and fancies of Wilson's were neatly turned and cute. So he carried a handful of them around one day and read them to some of the chief citizens. But irony was not for those people. Their mental vision was not focused for it. They read those playful trifles in the solidest terms, and decided without hesitancy that if there had ever been any doubt that Dave Wilson was a Pudd'nhead, which there hadn't, this revelation removed that doubt for good and all. That is just the way in this world. An enemy can partly ruin a man, but it takes a good-natured, injudicious friend to complete the thing and make it perfect. After this the judge felt tenderer than ever toward Wilson, and surer than ever that his calendar had merit. Judge Driscoll could be a free thinker and still hold his place in society because he was the person of most consequence to the community, and therefore could venture to go his own way and follow out his own notions. The other member of his pet organization was allowed the like liberty because he was a cipher in the estimation of the public, and nobody attached any importance to what he thought or did. He was liked, he was welcome enough all around, but he simply didn't count for anything. The widow Cooper, affectionately called Aunt Patsy by everybody, lived in a snug and comely cottage with her daughter Rowena, who was 19, romantic, amiable, and very pretty, but otherwise of no consequence. Rowena had a couple of young brothers, also of no consequence. The widow had a large spare room which she let to a lodger with board, when she could find one, but this room had been empty for a year now, to her sorrow. Her income was only sufficient for the family support, and she needed the lodging money for trifling luxuries. But now, at last, on a flaming June day, she found herself happy. Her tedious wait was ended. Her year-worn advertisement had been answered, and not by a village applicant. No, no. This letter was from away off yonder in the dim great world to the north. It was from St. Louis. She sat on her porch, gazing out with unseeing eyes upon the shining reaches of the mighty Mississippi, her thoughts steeped in her good fortune. Indeed, it was specially good fortune, for she was to have 2 lodgers instead of 1. She had read the letter to the family, and Rowena had danced away to see to the cleaning and airing of the room by the slave woman, Nancy, and the boys had rushed abroad in the town to spread the great news, for it was a matter of public interest, and the public would wonder and not be pleased if not informed. Presently Rowena returned, all ablush with joyous excitement, and begged for a rereading of the letter. It was framed thus: "Honored Madam, my brother and I have seen your advertisement by chance, and beg leave to take the room you offer. We are 24 years of age, and twins. We are Italians by birth, and have lived long in the various countries of Europe and several years in the United States. Our names are Luigi and Angelo Capello. You desire but 1 guest, but, dear madam, if you will allow us to pay for 2, we will not incommode you. We shall be down Thursday."
Italians! How romantic! Just think, Ma, there's never been one in this town, and everybody will be dying to see them, and they're all ours. Think of that. Yes, I reckon they'll make a grand stir. Oh, indeed they will. The whole town will be on its head. Think, they've been in Europe and everywhere. There's never been a traveler in this town before, Ma. I shouldn't wonder if they've seen kings. Well, a body can't tell, but they'll make stir enough without that. Yes, that's of course. Luigi, Angelo, they're lovely names, and so grand and foreign, not like Jones and Robinson and such. Thursday they are coming, and this is only Tuesday. It's a cruel long time to wait. Here comes Judge Driscoll in at the gate. He's heard about it. I'll go and open the door.
The judge was full of congratulations and curiosity. The letter was read and discussed. Soon Justice Robinson arrived with more congratulations, and there was a new reading and a new discussion. This was the beginning. Neighbor after neighbor of both sexes followed, and the procession drifted in and out all day and evening and all Wednesday and Thursday. The letter was read and reread until it was nearly worn out. Everybody admired its courtly and gracious tone and smooth and practiced style. Everybody was sympathetic and excited, and the Coopers were steeped in happiness all the while. The boats were very uncertain in low water in these primitive times. This time the Thursday boat had not arrived at 10 at night, so the people had waited at the landing all day for nothing. They were driven to their homes by a heavy storm without having had a view of the illustrious foreigners. 11 o'clock came, and the Cooper house was the only one in town that still had lights burning. The rain and thunder were booming yet, and the anxious family were still waiting, still hoping. At last there was a knock at the door, and the family jumped to open it. 2 negro men entered, each carrying a trunk, and proceeded upstairs toward the guest-room. Then entered the twins, the handsomest, the best dressed, the most distinguished-looking pair of young fellows the West had ever seen. One was a little fairer than the other, but otherwise they were exact duplicates. End of Chapter 5. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. Chapter 6. Swimming in Glory. Let us endeavor so to live that when we come to die even the undertaker will be sorry. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. Habit is habit, and not to be flung out of the window by any man, but coaxed downstairs a step at a time. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. At breakfast in the morning, the twins' charm of manner and easy and polished bearing made speedy conquest of the family's good graces. All constraint and formality quickly disappeared, and the friendliest feeling succeeded. Aunt Patsy called them by their Christian names almost from the beginning. She was full of the keenest curiosity about them, and showed it. They responded by talking about themselves, which pleased her greatly. It presently appeared that in their early youth they had known poverty and hardship. As the talk wandered along, the old lady watched for the right place to drop in a question or two concerning that matter, and when she found it, she said to the blonde twin, who was now doing the biographies in his turn while the brunette one rested, "If it ain't asking what I ought not to ask, Mr. Angelo, How did you come to be so friendless and in such trouble when you were little? Do you mind telling? But don't if you do." "Oh, we don't mind it at all, madam. In our case it was merely misfortune and nobody's fault. Our parents were well-to-do there in Italy, and we were their only child. We were of the old Florentine nobility." Rowena's heart gave a great bound, her nostrils expanded, and a fine light played in her eyes. "And when the war broke out, my father was on the losing side and had to fly for his life. His estates were confiscated, his personal property seized, and there we were in Germany, strangers, friendless, and in fact paupers. My brother and I were 10 years old, and well educated for that age, very studious, very fond of our books, and well grounded in the German, French, Spanish, and English languages. Also, we were marvelous musical prodigies, if you will allow me to say it, it being only the truth. Our father survived his misfortunes only a month. Our mother soon followed him, and we were alone in the world. Our parents could have made themselves comfortable by exhibiting us as a show, and they had many and large offers, but the thought revolted their pride, and they said they would starve and die first. But what they wouldn't consent to do, we had to do without the formality of consent. We were seized for the debts occasioned by their illness and their funerals, and placed among the attractions of a cheap museum in Berlin to earn the liquidation money. It took us 2 years to get out of that slavery. We traveled all about Germany, receiving no wages, and not even our keep. We had to be exhibited for nothing, and beg our bread. Well, madam, the rest is not of much consequence. When we escaped from that slavery at 12 years of age, we were in some respects men. Experience had taught us some valuable things, among others how to take care of ourselves, how to avoid and defeat sharks and sharpers, and how to conduct our own business for our own profit and without other people's help. We traveled everywhere, years and years, picking up smatterings of strange tongues, familiarizing ourselves with strange sights and strange costumes, accumulating an education of a wide and varied and curious sort. It was a pleasant life. We went to Venice, to London, Paris, Russia, India, China, Japan. At this point Nancy, the slave woman, thrust her head in at the door and exclaimed,
"Oh, missus, the house is plumb jam full of people, and dey's just a-spilin' to see the gentleman."
She indicated the twins with a nod of her head and tucked it back out of sight again. It was a proud occasion for the widow, and she promised herself high satisfaction in showing off her fine foreign birds before her neighbors and friends. Simple folk who had hardly ever seen a foreigner of any kind, and never one of any distinction or style. Yet her feeling was moderate indeed when contrasted with Rowena's. Rowena was in the clouds. She walked on air. This was to be the greatest day, the most romantic episode in the colorless history of that dull country town. She was to be familiarly near the source of its glory, and feel the full blood of it pour over her and about her. The other girls could only gaze and envy, not partake. The widow was ready, Rowena was ready, so also were the foreigners. The party moved along the hall, the twins in advance, and entered the open parlor door, whence issued a low hum of conversation. The twins took a position near the door. The widow stood at Luigi's side, Rowena stood beside Angelo, and the march passed and the introductions began. The widow was all smiles and contentment. She received the procession and passed it on to Rowena.
"Good morning, Sister Cooper."
Handshake.
"Good morning, Brother Higgins. Count Luigi, Capello, Mr. Higgins."
Handshake, followed by a devouring stare and "Glad to see you" on the part of Higgins, and a courteous inclination of the head and a pleasant "most happy" on the part of Count Luigi. "Good morning, Roweny." Handshake.
"Good morning, Mr. Higgins. Present you to Count Angelo Capello."
Handshake, admiring stare.
"Glad to see you."
Courteous nod, smiley "most happy," and Higgins passes on. None of these visitors was at ease, but being honest people, they didn't pretend to be. None of them had ever seen a person bearing a title of nobility before, and none had been expecting to see one now. Consequently, the title came upon them as a kind of pile-driving surprise, and caught them unprepared. A few tried to rise to the emergency, and got out an awkward "My Lord," or "Your Worship," or something of that sort. But the great majority were overwhelmed by the unaccustomed word and its dim and awful associations with gilded courts and stately ceremony and anointed kingship, so they only fumbled through the handshake and passed on, speechless. Now and then, as happens at all receptions everywhere, a more than ordinary friendly soul blocked the procession and kept it waiting while he inquired how the brothers liked the village, and how long they were going to stay, and if their family was well, and dragged in the weather, and hoped it would get cooler soon, and all that sort of thing, so as to be able to say, when he got home, "I had quite a long talk with them." But nobody did or said anything of a regrettable kind, and so the great affair went through to the end in a creditable and satisfactory fashion. General conversations followed, and the twins drifted about from group to group, talking easily and fluently, and winning approval, compelling admiration, and achieving favor from all. The widow followed their conquering march with a proud eye, and every now and then Rowena said to herself with deep satisfaction, "And to think they are ours, all ours." There were no idle moments for mother or daughter. Eager inquiries concerning the twins were pouring into their enchanted ears all the time. Each was the constant center of a group of breathless listeners. Each recognized that she knew now for the first time the real meaning of that great word glory, and perceived the stupendous value of it, and understood why men in all ages had been willing to throw away meaner happiness, treasure, life itself, to get a taste of its sublime and supreme joy. Napoleon and all his kind stood accounted for, and justified. When Rowena had at last done all her duty by the people in the parlor, she went upstairs to satisfy the longings of an overflow meeting there, for the parlor was not big enough to hold all the comers. Again she was besieged by eager questioners, and again she swam in the sunset seas of glory. When the forenoon was nearly gone, she recognized with a pang that this most splendid episode of her life was almost over, that nothing could prolong it, that nothing quite its equal could ever fall to her fortune again. But never mind, it was sufficient unto itself. The grand occasion had moved on an ascending scale from the start, and was a noble and memorable success. If the twins could but do some crowning act now to climax it, something usual, something startling, something to concentrate upon themselves the company's loftiest admiration, something in the nature of an electric surprise. Here a prodigious slam-banging broke out below, and everybody rushed down to see. It was the twins, knocking out a classic four-handed piece on the piano in great style. Rowena was satisfied down to the bottom of her heart. The young strangers were kept long at the piano. The villagers were astonished and enchanted with the magnificence of their performance, and could not bear to have them stop. All the music that they had ever heard before seemed spiritless prentice work and barren of grace and charm when compared with these intoxicating floods of melodious sound. They realized that for once in their lives they were hearing masters. End of chapter 6. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson, by Mark Twain. Chapter 7. The Unknown Nymph. One of the most striking differences between a cat and a lie is that a cat has only 9 lives. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. The company broke up reluctantly, and drifted toward their several homes, chatting with vivacity, and all agreeing that it would be many a long day before Dawson's Landing would see the equal of this one again. The twins had accepted several invitations while the reception was in progress, and had also volunteered to play some duets at an amateur entertainment for the benefit of a local charity. Society was eager to receive them to its bosom. Judge Driscoll had the good fortune to secure them for an immediate drive, and to be the first to display them in public. They entered his buggy with him, and were paraded down the main street, everybody flocking to the windows and sidewalks to see. The judge showed the strangers the new graveyard and the jail, and where the richest man lived, and the Freemasons' Hall, and the Methodist Church, and the Presbyterian Church, and where the Baptist Church was going to be when they got some money to build it with, and showed them the town hall and the slaughterhouse, and got out the Independent Fire Company in uniform, and had them put out an imaginary fire. Then he let them inspect the muskets of the militia company, and poured out an exhaustless stream of enthusiasm over all these splendors, and seemed very well satisfied with the responses he got, for the twins admired his admiration, and paid him back the best they could, though they could have done better if some 15 or 1,600,000 previous experiences of this sort in various countries had not already rubbed off a considerable part of the novelty in it. The judge laid himself out hospitality to make them have a good time, and if there was a defect anywhere, it was not his fault. He told them a good many humorous anecdotes, and always forgot the nub, but they were always able to furnish it, for these yarns were of a pretty early vintage, and they had had many a rejuvenating pull at them before. And he told them all about his several dignities, and how he had held this and that and the other place of honor or profit, and had once been to the legislature, and was now president of the Society of Free Thinkers. He said the society had been in existence 4 years, and already had 2 members, and was firmly established. He would call for the brothers in the evening if they would like to attend a meeting of it. Accordingly, he called for them, and on the way he told them all about Pudd'nhead Wilson, in order that they might get a favorable impression of him in advance and be prepared to like him. The scheme succeeded. The favorable impression was achieved. Later it was confirmed and solidified when Wilson proposed that out of courtesy to the strangers the usual topics be put aside and the hour be devoted to conversation upon ordinary subjects and the cultivation of friendly relations and good fellowship, a proposition which was put to vote and carried. The hour passed quickly away in lively talk, and when it was ended, the lonesome and neglected Wilson was richer by 2 friends than he had been when it began. He invited the twins to look in at his lodgings presently, after disposing of an intervening engagement, and they accepted with pleasure. Toward the middle of the evening they found themselves on the road to his house. Pudd'nhead was at home waiting for them, and putting in his time puzzling over a thing which had come under his notice that morning. The matter was this. He happened to be up very early, at dawn in fact, and he crossed the hall, which divided his cottage through the center, and entered a room to get something there. The window of the room had no curtains, for that side of the house had long been unoccupied, and through this window he caught sight of something which surprised and interested him. It was a young woman where properly no young woman belonged, for she was in Judge Driscoll's house, and in the bedroom over the judge's private study or sitting-room. This was young Tom Driscoll's bedroom. He and the judge's widowed sister, Mrs. Pratt, and 3 negro servants were the only people who belonged in the house. Who, then, might this young lady be? The 2 houses were separated by an ordinary yard, with a low fence running back through its middle from the street in front to the lane in the rear. The distance was not great, and Wilson was able to see the girl very well, the window shades of the room she was in being up, and the window also. The girl had on a neat and trim summer dress, patterned in broad stripes of pink and white, and her bonnet was equipped with a pink veil. She was practicing steps, gaits, and attitudes, apparently. She was doing the thing gracefully, and was very much absorbed in her work. Who could she be, and how came she to be in young Tom Driscoll's room? Wilson had quickly chosen a position from which he could watch the girl without running much risk of being seen by her, and he remained there hoping she would raise her veil and betray her face. But she disappointed him. After a matter of 20 minutes she disappeared, and although he stayed at his post half an hour longer, she came no more. Toward noon he dropped in at the judge's and talked with Mrs. Pratt about the great event of the day, the levee of the distinguished foreigners at Aunt Patsy Cooper's. He asked after her nephew Tom, and she said he was on his way home, and that she was expecting him to arrive a little before night, and added that she and the judge were gratified to gather from his letters that he was conducting himself very nicely and creditably, at which Wilson winked to himself privately. Wilson did not ask if there was a newcomer in the house, but he asked questions that would have brought light-throwing answers as to that matter if Mrs. Pratt had had any light to throw. So he went away satisfied that he knew of things that were going on in her house of which she herself was not aware. He was now awaiting for the twins, and still puzzling over the problem of who that girl might be, and how she happened to be in that young fellow's room at daybreak in the morning. End of Chapter 7. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. Chapter 8. Mars Tom Tramples His Chance. The holy passion of friendship is of so sweet and steady and loyal and enduring a nature that it will last through a whole lifetime, if not asked to lend money. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. Consider well the proportions of things. It is better to be a young June bug than an old bird of paradise. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. It is necessary now to hunt up Roxy. At the time she was set free and went away chambermaiding, she was 35. She got a berth as second chambermaid on a Cincinnati boat in the New Orleans trade, the Grand Mogul. A couple of trips made her wanted and easy-going at the work, and infatuated her with the stir and adventure and independence of steamboat life. Then she was promoted and become head chambermaid. She was a favorite with the officers, and exceedingly proud of their joking and friendly way with her. During 8 years she served 3 parts of the year on that boat, and the winters on a Vicksburg packet. But now for 2 months she had had rheumatism in her arms and was obliged to let the wash-tub alone. So she resigned. But she was well fixed, rich, as she would have described it, for she had lived a steady life and had banked $4 every month in New Orleans as a provision for her old age. She said in the start that she had put shoes on one bar-footed nigger to trample on her with, and that one mistake like that was enough. She would be independent of the human race thenceforth forevermore if hard work and economy could accomplish it. When the boat touched the levee at New Orleans, she bade good-bye to her comrades on the Grand Mogul and moved her kit ashore. But she was back in an hour. The bank had gone to smash and carried her $400 with it. She was a pauper and homeless, also disabled bodily, at least for the present. The officers were full of sympathy for her in her trouble, and made up a little purse for her. She resolved to go to her birthplace. She had friends there among the negroes, and the unfortunate always help the unfortunate. She was well aware of that. Those lowly comrades of her youth would not let her starve. She took the little local packet at Cairo, and now she was on the home stretch. Time had worn away her bitterness against her son, and she was able to think of him with serenity. She put the vile side of him out of her mind, and dwelt only on recollections of his occasional acts of kindness to her. She gilded and otherwise decorated these, and made them very pleasant to contemplate. She began to long to see him. She would go and fawn upon him slave-like, for this would have to be her attitude, of course. And maybe she would find that time had modified him, and that he would be glad to see his long-forgotten old nurse and treat her gently. That would be lovely. That would make her forget her woes and her poverty. Her poverty! That thought inspired her to add another castle to her dream. Maybe he would give her a trifle now and then. Maybe $1 once a month, say. Any little thing like that would help, oh, ever so much. By the time she reached Dawson's Landing, she was her old self again. Her blues were gone. She was in high feather. She would get along, surely. There were many kitchens where servants would share their meals with her, and also steal sugar and apples and other dainties for her to carry home, or give her a chance to pilfer them herself, which would answer just as well. And there was the church. She was a more rabid and devoted Methodist than ever, and her piety was no sham, but was strong and sincere. Yes, with plenty of creature comforts and her old place in the Amen corner in her possession again, she would be perfectly happy and at peace thenceforward to the end. She went to Judge Driscoll's kitchen first of all. She was received there in great form and with vast enthusiasm. Her wonderful travels and the strange countries she had seen and the adventures she had had made her a marvel and a heroine of romance. The negroes hung enchanted upon a great story of her experiences, interrupting her all along with eager questions, with laughter, exclamations of delight, and expressions of applause. And she was obliged to confess to herself that if there was anything better in this world than steamboating, it was the glory to be got by telling about it. The audience loaded her stomach with their dinners, and then stole the pantry bare to load up her basket. Tom was in St. Louis. The servant said he had spent the best part of his time there during the previous 2 years. Roxy came every day and had many talks about the family and its affairs. Once she asked why Tom was away so much. The ostensible Chambers said, "Fact is, old master can get along better when young master's away than he can when he's into town. Yes, and they love him better, too. So he gives them $50 a month." "No, that's so? Chambers, you's a joking, ain't you?" "'Clah, no, to goodness I ain't, mammy. Marse Tom told me so his own self. But never mind, 'tain't enough." "My land, what the reason 'tain't enough?" "Well, I's going to tell you, if you give me a chance, mammy. The reason 'tain't enough is 'case Marse Tom gambles." Roxy threw up her hands in astonishment, and Chambers went on. "Old master found it out, 'cause he had to pay $200 for Marse Tom's gambling debts, and that's true, mammy, just as dead certain as you's born." $200? Why, what is you talking about? $200? Sakes alive, it's most enough to buy a tolerable good second-hand nigger with. And you ain't lying, honey. You wouldn't lie to your old mammy. It's God's own truth, just as I tell you, $200. I wisht I may never stir out in my tracks if it ain't so. And, oh, my land, old Mars was just a-hoppin'. He was bilin' mad, I tell you. He tucken disinherit him." "Disinwhiched him?" "Disinherit him." "What's that? What do you mean?" "Means he busted the will." "Busted the will? He wouldn't ever treat him so. Take it back, you miserable imitation nigger that I bore in sorrow and tribulation." Roxy's pet castle, an occasional dollar from Tom's pocket, was tumbling to ruin before her eyes. She could not abide such a disaster as that. She couldn't endure the thought of it. Her remark amused Chambers. Yeah, just listen to that. If I's imitation, what is you? Both of us is imitation white, that's what we is, and powerful good imitation, too. Yeah. We don't mount to nothing as imitation niggers, and as for—" "Shut up your foolin', 'fore I knock you side of head, and tell me about the will. Tell me 'tain't busted, do, honey, and I'll never forget you." "Well, 'tain't, case dey's a new one made, and Marse Tom all right again. But what is you in sich a sweat about it for, mammy? 'Tain't none of your business, I don't reckon." "'Tain't none of my business? Whose business is it, then, I'd like to know? Was I his mother till he was 15 years old, or wasn't I? You answer me that. And you expect I could see him turned out poor and ordinary on the world and never care nothing about it? I reckon if you'd ever been a mother yourself, valet de Chambers, you wouldn't talk such foolishness as that." "Well, then, old Mars forgive him and fixed up the will again. Do that satisfy you?" Yes, she was satisfied now, and quite happy and sentimental over it. She kept coming daily, and at last she was told that Tom had come home. She began to tremble with emotion, and straightway sent to beg him to let his "poor old nigger mammy have just one sight of him and die for joy." Tom was stretched at his lazy ease on a sofa when Chambers brought the petition. Time had not modified his ancient detestation of the humble drudge and protector of his boyhood. It was still bitter and uncompromising. He sat up and bent a severe gaze upon the face of the young fellow whose name he was unconsciously using, and whose family rights he was enjoying. He maintained the gaze until the victim of it had become satisfactorily pallid with terror. Then he said, "What does that old rip want with me?" The petition was meekly repeated. "Who gave you permission to come and disturb me with the social attentions of niggers?" Tom had risen. The other young man was trembling now, visibly. He saw what was coming, and bent his head sideways and put up his left arm to shield it. Tom rained cuffs upon the head and its shield, saying no word. The victim received each blow with a beseeching, "Please, Mars Tom, oh, please, Mars Tom," 7 blows. Then Tom said, "Face the door. March." He followed behind with 1, 2, 3 solid kicks. The last one helped the pure white slave over the door-sill, and he limped away, mopping his eyes with his old ragged sleeve. Tom shouted after him, "Send her in." Then he flung himself panting on the sofa again, and rasped out the remark, "He arrived just at the right moment. I was full to the brim with bitter thinkings, and nobody to take it out of. How refreshing it was! I feel better." Tom's mother entered now, closing the door behind her, and approached her son with all the wheedling and supplication servilities that fear and interest can impart to the words and attitudes of the born slave. She stopped a yard from her boy and made 2 or 3 admiring exclamations over his manly stature and general handsomeness, and Tom put an arm under his head and hoisted a leg over the sofa back in order to look properly indifferent.
"My land, how you is growed, honey! 'Clar to goodness, I wouldn't 'a' knowed you, Marse Tom. 'Deed I wouldn't. Look at me good. Does you remember old Roxy? Does you know your old nigger mammy, honey? Well, now, I can lay down and die in peace, 'cause I've seen—"
"Cut it short, goddammit, cut it short! What is it you want?"
You hear that? Just the same old Marse Tom, all so gay and funnin' with the old mammy. I's just as short.
"Cut it short, I tell you, and get along. What do you want?" This was a bitter disappointment. Roxy had for so many days nourished and fondled and petted her notion that Tom would be glad to see his old nurse, and would make her proud and happy to the marrow with a cordial word or two, that it took 2 rebuffs to convince her that he was not funning, and that her beautiful dream was a fond and foolish variety, a shabby and pitiful mistake. She was hurt to the heart, and so ashamed that for a moment she did not quite know what to do or how to act. Then her breast began to heave, the tears came, and in her forlornness she was moved to try that other dream of hers, an appeal to her boy's charity, and so, upon the impulse, and without reflection, she offered her supplication.
"Oh, Marse Tom, de poor old mammy is in sich hard luck these days, and she's kind of crippled in the arms and can't work, and if you could give me $1, only just one little $1—"
Tom was on his feet so suddenly that the supplicant was startled into a jump herself. "$1? Give you $1? I've a notion to strangle you. Is that your errand here? Clear out, and be quick about it." Roxy backed slowly toward the door. When she was halfway she stopped and said mournfully,
"Marse Tom, I nursed you when you was a little baby, and I raised you all by myself till you was most a young man, and now you is young and rich, and I is poor and getting old, and I come here believing that you would help the old mammy long down the old road that's left twixt her and the grave, and—"
Tom relished this tune less than any that had preceded it, for he began to wake up a sort of echo in his conscience. So he interrupted, and said with decision, though without asperity, that he was not in a situation to help her, and wasn't going to do it.
"Ain't you ever going to help me, Marse Tom?"
"No. Now go away and don't bother me any more." Roxy's head was down in an attitude of humility, but now the fires of her old wrongs flamed up in her breast and began to burn fiercely. She raised her head slowly till it was well up, and at the same time her great frame unconsciously assumed an erect and masterful attitude, with all the majesty and grace of her vanished youth in it. She raised her finger and punctuated with it,
"You has said the word. You has had your chance, and you has trampled it under your foot. When you get another one, you'll get down on your knees and beg for it."
A cold chill went to Tom's heart, and he didn't know why, for he did not reflect that such words from such an incongruous source, and so solemnly delivered, could not easily fail of that effect. However, he did the natural thing. He replied with bluster and mockery, "You'll give me a chance? You! Perhaps I'd better get down on my knees now. But in case I don't, just for argument's sake, what's going to happen, pray?"
"Dis is what is gwine to happen. I's gwine as straight to your uncle as I can walk, and tell him every last thing I knows about you."
Tom's cheek blenched, and she saw it. Disturbing thoughts began to chase each other through his head. How can she know? And yet she must have found out. She looks it. I've had the will back only 3 months, and I'm already deep in debt again, and moving heaven and earth to save myself from exposure and destruction, with a reasonably fair show of getting the thing covered up, if I'm let alone. And now this fiend has gone and found me out somehow or other. I wonder how much she knows. It's enough to break a body's heart. but I've got to humor her. There's no other way." Then he worked up a rather sickly sample of a gay laugh and a hollow chipperness of manner, and said, "Well, well, Roxy dear, old friends like you and me mustn't quarrel. Here's your $1. Now tell me what you know." He held out the wildcat bill. She stood as she was, and made no movement. It was her turn to scorn persuasive foolery now, and she did not waste it. She said, with a grim implacability in voice and manner which made Tom almost realize that even a former slave can remember for 10 minutes insults and injuries returned for compliments and flatteries received, and can also enjoy taking revenge for them when the opportunity offers.
"What does I know? I'll tell you what I knows. I knows enough to bust that will to flinders, and more, mind you, more."
Tom was aghast. "More?" he said. "What do you call more? Where is there any room for more?" Roxy laughed a mocking laugh, and said scoffingly, with a toss of her head and her hands on her hip,
"Yes? Oh, I reckon. 'Cause you'd like to know, with your poor little old rag dollar, what you reckon I's going to tell you for? You ain't got no money. I's going to tell your uncle, and I'll do it this minute, too. He'll give me $5 for the news, and mighty glad, too."
She swung herself around disdainfully and started away. Tom was in a panic. He seized her skirts and implored her to wait. She turned and said loftily,
"Look here. What is it I told you?"
I don't remember anything. What was it you told me?"
"I told you that the next time I give you a chance you'd get down on your knees and beg for it."
Tom was stupefied for a moment. He was panting with excitement. Then he said, "Oh, Roxy, you wouldn't require your young master to do such a horrible thing. You can't mean it."
"I'll tell you now, mighty quick, whether I means it or not. You call me names, and as good as spit on me when I comes here, po and ordinary and humble, to praise you for being growed up so fine and handsome, and tell you how I used to nuss you and tend you and watch you when you was sick and hadn't no mother but me in the whole world, and beg you to give the poor old nigger $1 for to get her something to eat, and you call me names. Names, dad blame you. Yes, sir, I gives you just one chance more, and that's now, and it lasts only half a second, you hear?"
Tom slumped to his knees and began to beg, saying,
"You see, I'm begging, and it's honest begging, too. Now tell me, Roxy, tell me."
The air of 2 centuries of unatoned insult and outrage looked down on him and seemed to drink in deep draughts of satisfaction. Then she said,
"Fine, nice young white gentleman kneeling down to a nigger wench. I's wanted to see that just once before I's called. Now, Gabriel, blow the horn. I's ready. Get up."
Tom did it. He said humbly, "Now, Roxy, don't punish me any more. I deserved what I've got, but be good and let me off with that. Don't go to Uncle. Tell me. I'll give you the $5.
"Yes, I bet you will, and you won't stop there, another. But I ain't going to tell you here."
"Good gracious, no."
"Is you feared of the haunted house?"
No."
"Well, then you come to the haunted house about 10:11 tonight, and climb up the ladder, 'cause the star steps is broke down, and you'll find me. I's a roosting in the haunted house 'cause I can't afford to roost nowheres else."
She started toward the door, but stopped and said,
"Give me the $1 bill."
He gave it to her. She examined it and said,
Like enough the bank's busted."
She started again, but halted again.
"Has you got any whiskey?"
"Yes, a little."
"Fetch it."
He ran to his room overhead and brought down a bottle which was 2/3 full. She tilted it up and took a drink. Her eyes sparked with satisfaction, and she tucked the bottle under her shawl, saying,
"It's prime. I'll take it along."
Tom humbly held the door for her, and she marched out as grim and erect as a grenadier. Chapter 8. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. Chapter 9. Tom Practices Sycophancy. Why is it that we rejoice at a birth and grieve at a funeral? It is because we are not the person involved. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. It is easy to find fault if one has that disposition. There was once a man who, not being able to find any other fault with his coal, complained that there were too many prehistoric toads in it. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. Tom flung himself on the sofa, and put his throbbing head in his hands and rested his elbows on his knees. He rocked himself back and forth and moaned. "I've knelt to a nigger wench," he muttered. "I thought I had struck the deepest depths of degradation before, but oh dear, it was nothing to this. Well, there is one consolation, such as it is. I've struck bottom this time. There's nothing lower." But that was a hasty conclusion. At 10 that night he climbed the ladder in the haunted house, pale, weak, and wretched. Roxy was standing in the door of one of the rooms, waiting, for she had heard him. This was a 2-story log house, which had acquired the reputation a few years ago of being haunted, and that was the end of its usefulness. Nobody would live in it afterward, or go near it by night, and most people even gave it a wide berth in the daytime. As it had no competition, it was called the haunted house. It was getting crazy and ruinous now from long neglect. It stood 300 yards beyond Pudd'nhead Wilson's house, with nothing between but vacancy. It was the last house in the town at the end. Tom followed Roxy into the room. She had a pile of clean straw in the corner for a bed. Some cheap but well-kept clothing was hanging on the wall. There was a tin lantern freckling the floor with little spots of light, and there were various soap and candle boxes scattered about, which served for chairs. The two sat down. Roxy said,
"Now then, I'll tell you straight off, and I'll begin to collect the money later on. I ain't no hurry. What does you reckon I's going to tell you?"
"Well, you... Oh, Roxy, don't make it too hard for me. Come right out and tell me you've found out somehow what a shape I'm in on account of dissipation and foolishness."
"Disposition and foolishness? No, sir, that ain't it. That just ain't enough at all, 'longside of what I knows."
Tom stared at her and said, "Why, Roxy, what do you mean?" She rose and gloomed above him like a fate.
"I mean this, and it's the Lord's truth. You ain't no more kin to Marse Driscoll than I is. That's what I means."
And her eyes flamed with triumph. "What?"
"Yes, sir, and that ain't all. You's a nigger. Born a nigger and a slave. And you's a nigger and a slave this minute. And if I opens my mouth, old Master Driscoll'll sell you down the river before you is 2 days older than what you is now." "It's a thundering lie, you miserable old blatherskite." "It ain't no lie, nuther. It's just the truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me. Yes, sir, you's my son."
"You devil!"
"And that poor boy that you's been a-kicking and a-cuffing today is Percy Driscoll's son and your master."
"You beast!"
"And his name is Tom Driscoll, and yours name's Valet de Chambers, and you ain't got no family name, because niggers don't have 'em."
Tom sprang up and seized a billet of wood and raised it, but his mother only laughed at him and said,
"Sit down, you pup. Does you think you can scare me? It ain't in you, nor de likes of you. I reckon you'd shoot me in the back, maybe, if you got a chance, for that's just your style. I knows you, through and through. But I don't mind getting killed, because all this is down in writing, and it's in safe hands, too, and the man that's got it knows where to look for the right man when I gets killed. Oh, bless your soul, if you puts your mother up for as big a fool as you is, you's powerful mistaken, I can tell you. Now then, you set still and behave yourself, and don't you get up and gin until I tell you."
Tom fretted and chafed a while in a whirlwind of disorganized sensations and emotions, and finally said, with something like settled conviction, "The whole thing is moonshine. Now then, go ahead and do your worst. I'm done with you." Roxy made no answer. She took the lantern and started for the door. Tom was in a cold panic in a moment.
Come back," he wailed. "I didn't mean it, Roxy. I take it all back, and I'll never say it again. Please come back, Roxy."
The woman stood a moment, and she said gravely,
"That's one thing you's got to stop, Valet de Chambers. You can't call me Roxy, same as if you was my equal. Children don't speak to they mammies like that. You call me Ma or Mammy, that's what you'll call me, leastways when they ain't nobody round. Say it."
It cost Tom a struggle, but he got it out.
"That's all right. Don't you ever forget it again, if you knows what's good for you.
Now then, you had said you wouldn't ever call it lies and moonshine again. I'll tell you this for a warning. If you ever does say it again, it's the last time you'll ever say it to me. I'll tramp as straight to the judge as I can walk and tell him who you is and prove it. Does you believe me when I says that?" "Oh," groaned Tom, "I more than believe it. I know it." Roxy knew her conquest was complete. She could have proved nothing to anybody, and her threat of writings was a lie, but she knew the person she was dealing with, and had made both statements without any doubt as to the effect they would produce. She went and sat down on her candle-box, and the pride and pomp of her victorious attitude made it a throne. She said, "Now then, Chambers, we's gwine to talk business, and there ain't gwine to be no more foolishness. In the first place, you gets $50 a month. You's gwine to hand over half of it to your ma. Plank it out." But Tom had only $6 in the world. He gave her that, and promised to start fair on next month's pension. "Chambers, how much is you in debt?" Tom shuddered and said, "Nearly $300. "How's you going to pay it?" Tom groaned out, "Oh, I don't know. Don't ask me such awful questions." But she stuck to her point until she wearied a confession out of him. He had been prowling about in disguise, stealing small valuables from private houses. In fact, he made a good deal of a raid on his fellow villagers a fortnight before, when he was supposed to be in St. Louis. But he doubted if he had sent away enough stuff to realize the required amount, and was afraid to make a further venture in the present excited state of the town. His mother approved of his conduct and offered to help, but this frightened him. He tremblingly ventured to say that if she would retire from the town he should feel better and safer, and could hold his head higher, and was going to make an argument, but she interrupted and surprised him pleasantly by saying she was ready. It didn't make any difference to her where she stayed, so that she got her share of the pension regularly. She said she would not go far, and would call at the haunted house once a month for her money. Then she said, "I don't hate you so much now, but I've hated you a many a year, and anybody would. Didn't I change you off, and give you a good family and good name, and made you a white gentleman and rich, with store clothes on, and what did I get for it? You despised me all the time, and was allus saying mean, hard things to me before folks, and wouldn't ever let me forget I's a nigger, and She fell to sobbing and broke down. Tom said, "But you know I didn't know you were my mother, and besides—" "Well, never mind about that now. Let it go. I's going to forget it." Then she added fiercely, "And don't ever make me remember it again, or you'll be sorry, I tell you." When they were parting, Tom said in the most persuasive way he could command, "Ma, would you mind telling me who was my father?" He had supposed he was asking an embarrassing question. He was mistaken. Roxy drew herself up with a proud toss of her head and said, "Does I mind telling you? No, dat I don't. You ain't got no occasion to be ashamed of your father, I can tell you. He was the highest quality in this whole town, old Virginny stock. First families he was, just as good stock as the Driscolls and the Howards. The best dey ever seed." She put on a little prouder air, if possible, and added impressively, "Does you 'member Colonel Cecil Burley Essex, that died the same year your young Mars Tom Driscoll's pappy died, and all the Masons and Oddfellers and churches turned out and give him the biggest funeral this town ever seed? That's the man." Under the inspiration of her soaring complacency, the departed graces of her earlier days returned to her, and her bearing took to itself a dignity and state that might have passed for queenly if her surroundings had been a little more in keeping with it. "Dey ain't another nigger in this town that's as high-born as you is. Now then, go 'long, and just you hold your head up as high as you want to. You has the right, and dat I can swear." End of Chapter 9. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. Chapter 10. The Nymph Revealed. All say, "How hard it is that we have to die!" A strange complaint to come from the mouths of people who have had to live. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. When angry, count 4. When very angry, swear. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. Every now and then, after Tom went to bed,
He had sudden wakings out of his sleep, and his first thought was, "Oh, joy! It was all a dream." Then he laid himself heavily down again, with a groan and the muttered words, "A nigger! I am a nigger! Oh, I wish I was dead!" He woke at dawn with one more repetition of this horror, and then he resolved to meddle no more with that treacherous sleep. He began to think. Sufficiently bitter thinkings they were. They wandered along something after this fashion. Why were niggers and whites made? What crime did the uncreated first nigger commit that the curse of birth was decreed for him? And why is this awful difference made between white and black? How hard the nigger's fate seems this morning, yet until last night such a thought never entered my head. He sighed and groaned an hour or more away. Then Chambers came humbly in to say that breakfast was nearly ready. Tom blushed scarlet to see this aristocratic white youth cringe to him, a nigger, and call him young marster. He said roughly, "Get out of my sight!" And when the youth was gone, he muttered, "He has done me no harm, poor wretch, but he is an eyesore to me now, for he is Driscoll, the young gentleman, and I am oh, I wish I was dead." A gigantic eruption, like that of Krakatoa a few years ago, with the accompanying earthquakes, tidal waves, and clouds of volcanic dust, changes the face of the surrounding landscape beyond recognition, bringing down the high lands, elevating the low, making fair lakes where deserts had been, and deserts where green prairies had smiled before. The tremendous catastrophe which had befallen Tom had changed his moral landscape in much the same way. Some of his low places he found lifted to ideals, some of his ideas had sunk to the valleys, and lay there with the sackcloth and ashes of pumice stone and sulphur on their ruined heads. For days he wandered in lonely places, thinking, trying to get his bearings. It was new work. If he had met a friend, he found that the habit of a lifetime had in some mysterious way vanished. His arm hung limp instead of involuntarily extending the hand for a shake. It was the nigger in him asserting its humility, and he blushed and was abashed. And the nigger in him was surprised when the white friend put out his hand for a shake with him. He found the nigger in him involuntarily giving the road on the sidewalk to a white rowdy and loafer. When Rowena, the dearest thing his heart knew, the idol of his secret worship, invited him in, the nigger in him made an embarrassed excuse and was afraid to enter and sit with the dread white folks on equal terms. The nigger in him went shrinking and skulking here and there and yonder, and fancying it saw suspicion and maybe detection in all faces, tones, and gestures. So strange and uncharacteristic was Tom's conduct that people noticed it and turned to look after him when he passed on. And when he glanced back, as he could not help doing in spite of his best resistance, and caught that puzzled expression in a person's face, it gave him a sick feeling, and he took himself out of view as quickly as he could. He presently came to have a hunted sense and a hunted look, and then he fled away to the hilltops and the solitudes. He said to himself that the curse of Ham was upon him. He dreaded his meals. The nigger in him was ashamed to sit at the white folks' table, and feared discovery all the time. And once, when Judge Driscoll said, "What's the matter with you? You look as meek as a nigger," he felt as secret murderers are said to feel when the accuser says, "Thou art the man." Tom said he was not well, and left the table. His ostensible aunt's solicitudes and endearments were become a terror to him, and he avoided them. And all the time hatred of his ostensible uncle was steadily growing in his heart, for he said to himself, "He is white, and I am his chattel, his property, his goods, and he can sell me, just as he could his dog." For as much as a week after this, Tom imagined that his character had undergone a pretty radical change, but that was because he did not know himself. In several ways his opinions were totally changed, and would never go back to what they were before, but the main structure of his character was not changed and could not be changed. One or two very important features of it were altered, and in time effects would result from this, if opportunity offered, effects of a quite serious nature, too. Under the influence of a great mental and moral upheaval, his character and his habits had taken on the appearance of complete change, but after a while, with the subsidence of the storm, both began to settle toward their former places. He dropped gradually back into his old frivolous and easy-going ways and conditions of feeling and manner of speech, and no familiar of his could have detected anything in him that differentiated him from the weak and careless Tom of other days. The theft raid which he had made upon the village turned out better than he had ventured to hope. It produced the sum necessary to pay his gaming debts, and saved him from exposure to his uncle and another smashing of the will. He and his mother learned to like each other fairly well. She couldn't love him as yet, because there
"warn't nothing to him,"
as she expressed it, but her nature needed something or somebody to rule over, and he was better than nothing. Her strong character and aggressive and commanding ways compelled Tom's admiration in spite of the fact that he got more illustrations of them than he needed for his comfort. However, as a rule, her conversation was made up of racy tales about the privacies of the chief families of the town, for she went harvesting among their kitchens every time she came to the village, and Tom enjoyed this. It was just in his line. She always collected her half of his pension punctually, and he was always at the haunted house to have a chat with her on these occasions. Every now and then she paid him a visit there on between days also. Occasions he would run up to St. Louis for a few weeks, and at last temptation caught him again. He won a lot of money, but lost it, and with a deal more besides, which he promised to raise as soon as possible. For this purpose he projected a new raid on his town. He never meddled with any other town, for he was afraid to venture into houses whose ins and outs he did not know, and the habits of whose households he was not acquainted with. He arrived at the haunted house in disguise on the Wednesday before the advent of the twins, after writing his Aunt Pratt that he would not arrive until 2 days after, and laying in hiding there with his mother until toward daylight Friday morning, when he went to his uncle's house and entered by the back way with his own key, and slipped up to his room where he could have the use of the mirror and toilet articles. He had a suit of girl's clothes with him in a bundle as a disguise for his raid, and was wearing a suit of his mother's clothing, with black gloves and veil. By dawn he was tricked out for his raid, but he caught a glimpse of Pudd'nhead Wilson through the window over the way, and he knew that Pudd'nhead had caught a glimpse of him. So he entertained Wilson with some airs and graces and attitudes for a while, then stepped out of sight and resumed the other disguise, and by went down and out the back way and started downtown to reconnoiter the scene of his intended labors. But he was ill at ease. He had changed back to Roxy's dress, with the stoop of age added to the disguise, so that Wilson would not bother himself about a humble old woman leaving a neighbor's house by the back way in the early morning, in case he was still spying. But supposing Wilson had seen him leave, and had thought it suspicious, and had also followed him? The thought made Tom cold. He gave up the raid for the day, and hurried back to the haunted house by the obscurest route he knew. His mother was gone, but she came back by and by with the news of the grand reception at Patsy Cooper's, and soon persuaded him that the opportunity was like a special providence, it was so inviting and perfect. So he went raiding after all, and made a nice success of it while everybody was gone to Patsy Cooper's. Success gave him nerve and even actual intrepidity, insomuch, indeed, that after he had conveyed his harvest to his mother in a back alley, he went to the reception himself and added several of the valuables of that house to his takings. After this long digression, we have now arrived once more at the point where Pudd'nhead Wilson, while waiting for the arrival of the twins on that same Friday evening, sat puzzling over the strange apparition of that morning, a girl in young Tom Driscoll's bedroom, fretting and guessing and puzzling over it and wondering who the shameless creature might be. End of chapter 10. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain, Chapter 11, Pudd'nhead's Thrilling Discovery. There are 3 infallible ways of pleasing an author, and the 3 form a rising scale of compliment. 1, to tell him you have read one of his books. 2, to tell him you have read all of his books. 3, to ask him to let you read the manuscript of his forthcoming book. Number 1 admits you to his respect. Number 2 admits you to his admiration. Number 3 carries you clear into his heart. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. As to the adjective, when in doubt, strike it out. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. The twins arrived presently, and talk began. It flowed along chattily and sociably, and under its influence the new friendship gathered ease and strength. Wilson got out his calendar by request and read a passage or two from it, which the twins praised quite cordially. This pleased the author so much that he complied gladly when they asked him to lend them a batch of the work to read at home. In the course of their wide travels they had found out that there are 3 sure ways of pleasing an author. They were now working the best of the 3. There was an interruption now. Young Driscoll appeared and joined the party. He pretended to be seeing the distinguished strangers for the first time when they rose to shake hands, but this was only a blind, as he had already had a glimpse of them at the reception while robbing the house. The twins made mental note that he was smooth-faced and rather handsome, and smooth and undulatory in his movements, graceful, in fact. Angelo thought he had a good eye. Luigi thought there was something veiled and sly about it. Angelo thought he had a pleasant, free, and easy way of talking. Luigi thought it was more so than was agreeable. Angelo thought he was a sufficiently nice young man. Luigi reserved his decision. Tom's first contribution to the conversation was a question which he put to Wilson 100 times before. It was always cheerily and good-natured put, and always inflicted a little pang, for it touched a secret sore. But this time the pang was sharp, since strangers were present. "Well, how does the law come? Had a case yet?" Wilson bit his lip, but answered, "No, not yet," with as much indifference as he could assume. Judge Driscoll had generously left the law feature out of Wilson's biography, which he had furnished to the twins. Young Tom laughed pleasantly and said, "Wilson's a lawyer, gentlemen, but he doesn't practice now." The sarcasm bit, but Wilson kept himself under control and said without passion, "I don't practice, it is true. It is true that I have never had a case, and have had to earn a poor living for 20 years as an expert accountant in a town where I can't get a hold of a set of books to untangle as often as I should like. But it is also true that I did myself well for the practice of the law. By the time I was your age, Tom, I had chosen a profession, and was soon competent to enter upon it." Tom winced. "I never got a chance to try my hand at it, and I may never get a chance, and yet if I ever do get it, I shall be found ready, for I have kept up my law studies all these years." "That's it. That's good grit. I like to see it. I've a notion to throw all my business your way. My business and your law practice ought to make a pretty gay team, Dave," and the young fellow laughed again. "If you will throw—" Wilson had thought of the girl in Tom's bedroom, and was going to say, "If you will throw the surreptitious and disreputable part of your business my way, it may amount to something," but thought better of it, and said, "However, this matter doesn't fit well in a general conversation." "All right, we'll change the subject. I guess you were about to give me another dig, anyway, so I'm willing to change. How's the awful mystery flourishing these days? Wilson's got a scheme for driving plain window-glass panes out of the market by decorating with greasy finger marks, and getting rich by selling it at famine prices to the crowned heads over in Europe to outfit their palaces with. Fetch it out, Dave." Wilson brought 3 of his glass strips and said, "I get the subject to pass the fingers of his right hand through his hair, so as to get a little coating of the natural oil on them, and then press the balls of them on the glass. A fine and delicate print of the lines in the skin results, and is permanent, if it doesn't come in contact with something able to rub it off. You begin, Tom." "Why, I think you took my finger marks once or twice before." "Yes, but you were a little boy the last time, only about 12 years old." "That's so. Of course I've changed entirely since then, and variety is what the crowned heads want, I guess." He passed his fingers through his crop of short hair and pressed them one at a time on the glass. Angelo made a print of his fingers on another glass, and Luigi followed with a third. Wilson marked the glasses with names and dates and put them away. Tom gave one of his little laughs and said, "I thought I wouldn't say anything, but if variety is what you are after, you have wasted a piece of glass. The handprint of one twin is the same as the handprint of the fellow twin." "Well, it's done now, and I like to have them both, anyway," said Wilson, returned to his place. "But look here, Dave," said Tom, "you used to tell people's fortunes, too, when you took their finger marks. Dave's just an all-round genius, a genius of the first water, gentlemen, a great scientist running to seed here in this village, a prophet with the kind of honor that prophets generally get at home, for here they don't give shucks for his scientifics, and they call his skull a notion factory. Hey, Dave, ain't it so? But never mind, he'll make his mark some day. Finger mark, you know. But really, you want to let him take a shy at your palms once. It's worth twice the price of admission, or your money's returned at the door. Why, he'll read your wrinkles as easy as a book, and don't only tell you 50 or 60 things that's going to happen to you, but 50 or 60,000 that ain't. Come, Dave, show the gentleman what an inspired jack at all science we've got in this town, and don't know it." Wilson winced under this nagging and not very courteous chaff, and the twins suffered with him and for him. They rightly judged now that the best way to relieve him would be to take the thing in earnest and treat it with respect, ignoring Tom's rather overdone raillery. So Luigi said, "We have seen something of palmistry in our wanderings, and know very well what astonishing things it can do. If it isn't a science, and one of the greatest of them, too, I don't know what its other name ought to be. In the Orient—" Tom looked surprised and incredulous. He said, "That juggling a science? But really, you ain't serious, are you?" "Yes, entirely so. 4 years ago we had our hands read out to us as if our plans had been covered with print." "Well, do you mean to say there was actually anything in it?" asked Tom, his incredulity beginning to weaken a little. "There was this much in it," said Angelo. "What was told us of our characters was minutely exact. We could not have bettered it ourselves. Next, 2 or 3 memorable things that have happened to us were laid bare, things which no one present but ourselves could have known about." "Why, it's rank sorcery!" exclaimed Tom, who was now becoming very much interested. "And how did they make out with what was going to happen to you in the future?" "On the whole, quite fairly," said Luigi. 2 or 3 of the most striking things foretold have happened since. Much the most striking one of all happened within that same year. Some of the minor prophecies have come true, some of the minor and some of the major ones have not been fulfilled yet, and of course may never be. Still, I should be more surprised if they failed to arrive than if they didn't." Tom was entirely sobered and profoundly impressed. He said apologetically, "Dave, I wasn't meaning to belittle that science. I was only chattering, I reckon I'd better say. I wish you would look at their palms. Come, won't you?" "Why, certainly, if you want me to. But you know I've had no chance to become an expert, and don't claim to be one. When a past event is somewhat prominently recorded in the palm, I can generally detect that, but minor ones often escape me. Not always, of course, but often. But I haven't much confidence in myself when it comes to reading the future. I am talking as if palmistry was a daily study with me, but that is not so. I haven't examined half a dozen hands in the last half-dozen years. You see, the people got to joking about it, and I stopped to let the talk die down. I'll tell you what we'll do, Count Luigi. I'll make a try at your past, and if I have any success there— no, on the whole, I'll let the future alone. That's really the affair of an expert." He took Luigi's hand. Tom said, "Wait. Don't look yet, Dave. Count Luigi, here's paper and pencil. Set down that thing that you said was the most striking one that was foretold to you, and happened less than a year afterward, and give it to me so I can see if Dave finds it in your hand." Luigi wrote a line privately, and folded up the piece of paper and handed it to Tom, saying, "I'll tell you when to look at it, if he finds it." Wilson began to study Luigi's palm, tracing lifelines, heart lines, head lines, and so on, and noting carefully their relations with the cobweb of finer and more delicate marks and lines that enmeshed them on all sides. He felt of the fleshy cushion at the base of the thumb and noted its shape. He felt of the fleshy side of the hand between the wrist and the base of the little finger and noted its shape also. He painstakingly examined the fingers, observing their form, proportions, and natural manner of disposing themselves when in repose. All this process was watched by the three spectators with absorbing interest, their heads bent together over Luigi's palm, and nobody disturbing the stillness with a word. Wilson now entered upon a close survey of the palm again, and his revelations began. He mapped out Luigi's character and disposition, his tastes, aversions, proclivities, ambitions, and eccentricities, in a way which sometimes made Luigi wince and the others laugh, but both twins declared that the chart was artistically drawn and was correct. Next, Wilson took up Luigi's history. He proceeded cautiously and with hesitation now, moving his finger slowly along the great lines of the palm, and now and then halting it at a star or some such landmark, and examining that neighborhood minutely. He proclaimed one or two past events. Luigi confirmed his correctness, and the search went on. Presently Wilson glanced up suddenly with a surprised expression. "Here is a record of an incident which you would perhaps not wish me to—"
"Bring it out," said Luigi good-naturedly. "I promise you shan't embarrass me."
But Wilson still hesitated, and did not seem quite to know what to do. Then he said, "I think it is too delicate a matter to— I believe I would rather write it or whisper it to you, and let you decide for yourself whether you want it talked out or not."
"That will answer," said Luigi. "Write it."
Wilson wrote something on a slip of paper and handed it to Luigi, who read it to himself and said to Tom,
"Unfold your slip and read it, Mr. Driscoll."
Tom said,
"It was prophesied that I would kill a man. It came true before the year was out."
Tom added, "Great Scott!" Luigi handed Wilson's paper to Tom and said, "Now read this one." Tom read, "You have killed someone, but whether man, woman, or child, I do not make it out." "Caesar's ghost!" commented Tom, with astonishment. "It beats anything that was ever heard of. Why, a man's own hand is his deadliest enemy. Just think of that. A man's own hand keeps a record of the deepest and fatalest secrets of his life, and is treacherously ready to expose himself to any black magic stranger that comes along. But what do you let a person look at your hand for, with that awful thing printed on it?"
"Oh," said Luigi reposefully, "I don't mind it. I killed the man for good reasons, and I don't regret it."
"What were the reasons?"
"Well, he needed killing." "I'll tell you why he did it, since he won't say himself," said Angelo warmly. "He did it to save my life. That's what he did it for. So it was a noble act, and not a thing to be hid in the dark."
So it was, said Wilson. "To do such a thing to save a brother's life is a great and fine action."
"Now come," said Luigi. "It is very pleasant to hear you say these things, but for unselfishness or heroism or magnanimity the circumstances won't stand scrutiny. You overlook one detail. Suppose I hadn't saved Angelo's life, what would have become of mine? If I had let the man kill him, wouldn't he have killed me, too? I saved my own life, you see." "Yes, that is your way of talking," said Angelo, "but I know you. I don't believe you thought of yourself at all. I keep that weapon yet that Luigi killed the man with, and I'll show it to you some time. That incident makes it interesting, and it had a history before it came into Luigi's hands which adds to its interest. It was given to Luigi by a great Indian prince, the Gaikowar of Baroda, and it had been in his family 2 or 3 centuries. It killed a good many disagreeable people who troubled the hearthstone at one time or another. It isn't much to look at, except it isn't shaped like other knives, or dirks, or whatever it may be called. Here, I'll draw it for you." He took a sheet of paper and made a rapid sketch. "There it is, a broad and murderous blade, with edges like a razor for sharpness. The devices engraved on it are the ciphers or names of its long line of possessors. I had Luigi's name added in Roman letters myself, with our coat of arms, as you see. You notice what a curious handle the thing has. It is solid ivory, polished like a mirror, and is 4 or 5 inches long, round, and as thick as a large man's wrist, with the end squared off flat for your thumb to rest on, for you grasp it with your thumb resting on the blunt end, so,
and lift it along and strike downward. The Gaikowar showed us how the thing was done when he gave it to Luigi, and before that night was ended, Luigi had used the knife, and the Gaikowar was a man short by reason of it. The sheath is magnificently ornamented with gems of great value. You will find a sheath more worth looking at than the knife itself, of course. Tom said to himself, "It's lucky I came here. I would have sold that knife for a song. I supposed the jewels were glass." "But go on, don't stop," said Wilson. "Our curiosity is up now to hear about the homicide. Tell us about that." "Well, briefly, the knife was to blame for that all round. A native servant slipped into our room in the palace in the night to kill us and steal the knife on account of the fortune encrusted on its sheath, without a doubt. Luigi had it under his pillow. We were in bed together. There was a dim night light burning. I was asleep, but Luigi was awake, and he thought he detected a vague form nearing the bed. He slipped the knife out of the sheath, and was ready and unembarrassed by hampering bedclothes, for the weather was hot and we hadn't any. Suddenly that native rose at the bedside and bent over me with his right hand lifted and a dirk in it aimed at my throat. But Luigi grabbed his wrist, pulled him downward, and drove his own knife into the man's neck. That is the whole story." Wilson and Tom drew deep breaths, and after some general chat about the tragedy, Pudd'nhead said, taking Tom's hand, "Now, Tom, I've never had a look at your palms, as it happens. Perhaps you've got some little questionable privacies that need—" "Hello!" Tom had snatched away his hand and was looking a good deal confused. "Why, he's blushing," said Luigi. Tom darted an ugly look at him and said sharply, "Well, if I am, it ain't because I'm a murderer." Luigi's dark face flushed, and before he could speak or move, Tom added with an anxious haste, "Oh, I beg 1,000 pardons. I didn't mean that. It was out before I thought, and I'm very, very sorry. You must forgive me." Wilson came to the rescue and smoothed things down as well as he could, and in fact was entirely successful as far as the twins were concerned, for they felt sorrier for the affront put upon him by his guest's outburst of ill manners than for the insult offered to Luigi. But the success was not so pronounced with the offender. Tom tried to seem at his ease, and he went through the motions fairly well, but at bottom he felt resentful toward all the 3 witnesses of his exhibition. In fact, he felt so annoyed at them for having witnessed it and noticed it that he almost forgot to feel annoyed at himself for placing it before them. However, something presently happened which made him almost comfortable and brought him nearly back to a state of charity and friendliness. This was a little spat between the twins, not much of a spat, but still a spat, and before they got far with it, they were in a decided condition of irritation while pretending to be actuated by more respectable motives. By his help the fire got warmed up to the blazing point, and he might have had the happiness of seeing the flames show up in another moment, but for the interruption of a knock on the door, an interruption which fretted him as much as it gratified Wilson. Wilson opened the door. The visitor was a good-natured, ignorant, energetic, middle-aged Irishman named John Buckstone, who was a great politician in a small way, and always took a large share in public matters of every sort. One of the town's chief excitements just now was over the matter of rum. There was a strong rum party and a strong anti-rum party. Buckstone was training with the rum party, and he had been sent to hunt up the twins and invite them to attend a mass meeting of that faction. He delivered his errand and said the clans were already gathering in the big hall over the market-house. Luigi accepted the invitation cordially. Angelo less cordially, since he disliked crowds, and did not drink the powerful intoxicants of America. In fact, he was even a teetotaler sometimes, when it was judicious to be one. The twins left with Buckstone, and Tom Driscoll joined the company with them uninvited. In the distance one could see a long wavering line of torches drifting down the main street, and could hear the throbbing of the bass drum, the clash of cymbals, the squeaking of a fife or two, and the faint roar of remote hurrahs. The tail end of this procession was climbing the market-house stairs when the twins arrived in its neighborhood. When they reached the hall it was full of people, torches, smoke, noise, and enthusiasm. They were conducted to the platform by Buckstone, Tom Driscoll still following, and were delivered to the chairman in the midst of a prodigious explosion of welcome. When the noise had moderated a little, the chair proposed that our illustrious guests be at once elected, by complimentary acclamation, to membership in our ever-glorious organization, the paradise of the free and the perdition of the slave. This eloquent discharge opened the floodgates of enthusiasm again, and the election was carried with thundering unanimity. Then arose a storm of cries. "Wet them down! Wet them down! Give them a drink!" Glasses of whiskey were handed to the twins. Luigi waves his aloft, then brought it to his lips, but Angelo set his down. There was another storm of cries. "What's the matter with the other one? What is the blond one going back on us for? Explain! Explain!" The chairman inquired, and then reported, "We have made an unfortunate mistake, gentlemen. I find that the Count Angelo Capello is opposed to our creed, is a teetotaler, in fact, and was not intending to apply for membership with us. He desires that we reconsider the vote by which he was elected. What is the pleasure of the House?" There was a general burst of laughter, plentifully accented with whistlings and catcalls, but the energetic use of the gavel presently restored something like order. Then a man spoke from the crowd and said that while he was very, very sorry that the mistake had been made, it would not be possible to rectify it at the present meeting. According to the bylaws, it must go over to the next regular meeting for action. He would not offer a motion, as none was required. He desired to apologize to the gentleman in the name of the House, and begged to assure him that as far as it might lie in the power of the Sons of Liberty, his temporary membership in the order would be made pleasant for him. The speech was received with great applause, mixed with cries of, "That's the talk! He's a good fellow anyway, if he is a teetotaler. Drink his health! Give him a rouser, and no heel taps!" Glasses were handed around, and everybody on the platform drank Angelo's health, while the house bellowed forth in song, "For he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good fellow, for he's a jolly good fellow, which nobody can deny." Tom Driscoll drank. It was his second glass, for he had drunk Angelo's the moment that Angelo had set it down. The two drinks made him very merry, almost idiotically so, and he began to take a most lively and prominent part in the proceedings, particularly in the music and catcalls and side remarks. The chairman was still standing at the front, the twins at his side. The extraordinarily close resemblance of the brothers to each other suggested a witticism to Tom Driscoll, and just as the chairman began a speech, he skipped forward and said with an air of tipsy confidence to the audience, "Boys, I move that he keeps still and lets this human Filipina snip you out a speech." The descriptive aptness of the phrase caught the house, and a mighty burst of laughter followed. Luigi's Southern blood leapt to the boiling point in a moment under the sharp humiliation of this insult delivered in the presence of 400 strangers. It was not in the young man's nature to let the matter pass, or to delay the squaring of the account. He took a couple of strides and halted behind the unsuspecting joker. Then he drew back and delivered a kick of such titanic vigor that it lifted Tom clear over the footlights and landed him on the heads of the front row of the Sons of Liberty. Even a sober person does not like to have a human being emptied on him when he is not doing any harm. A person who is not sober cannot endure such an attention at all. The nest of Sons of Liberty that Driscoll landed in had not a sober bird in it. In fact, there was probably not an entirely sober one in the auditorium. Driscoll was promptly and indignantly flung on the heads of sons in the next row, and these sons passed him on toward the rear, and then immediately began to pummel the front row sons who had passed him to them. This course was strictly followed by bench after bench as Driscoll traveled in his tumultuous and airy flight toward the door. So he left behind him an ever-lengthening wake of raging and plunging and fighting and swearing humanity. Down went group after group of torches, and presently, above the deafening clatter of the gavel, roar of angry voices, and crash of succumbing benches, rose the paralyzing cry of "Fire!" The fighting ceased instantly, the cursing ceased. For one distinctly defined moment there was a dead hush, a motionless calm where the tempest had been. Then with one impulse the multitude awoke to life and energy again, and went surging and struggling and swaying this way and that, its outer edges melting away through windows and doors, and gradually lessening the pressure and relieving the mass. The fire boys were never on hand so suddenly before, for there was no distance to go this time, their quarters being in the rear end of the market-house. There was an engine company and a hook-and-ladder company. Half of each was composed of rummies and the other half of anti-rummies, after the moral and political share and share-alike fashion of the frontier town of the period. Enough anti-rummies were loafing in quarters to man the engine and the ladders. In 2 minutes they had their red shirts and helmets on. They never stirred officially in unofficial costume, and as the mass meeting overhead smashed through the long row of windows and poured out upon the roof of the arcade, the deliverers were ready for them with a powerful stream of water, which washed some of them off the roof and nearly drowned the rest. But water was preferable to fire, and still the stampede from the windows continued, and still the pitiless drenching assailed it until the building was empty. Then the fire boys mounted to the hall and flooded it with water enough to annihilate 40 times as much fire as there was there. For a village fire company does not often get a chance to show off, and so when it does get a chance, it makes the most of it. Such citizens of that village as were of a thoughtful and judicious temperament did not insure against fire, they insured against the fire company. End of chapter 11. The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. Chapter 12. The Shame of Judge Driscoll. Courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear. Except a creature be part coward, it is not a compliment to say it is brave. It is merely a loose misapplication of the word. Consider the flea, incomparably the bravest of all the creatures of God, if ignorance of fear were courage. Whether you are asleep or awake, he will attack you, caring nothing for the fact that in bulk and strength you are to him as are the massed armies of the earth to a sucking child. He lives both day and night, and all days and nights, in the very lap of peril and the immediate presence of death, and yet is no more afraid than is the man who walks the streets of a city that was threatened by an earthquake 10 centuries before. When we speak of Clive, Nelson, and Putnam as men who didn't know what fear was, we ought always to add the flea, and put him at the head of the procession. Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar. Judge Driscoll was in bed and asleep by 10 o'clock on Friday night, and he was up and gone a-fishing before daylight in the morning with his friend Pembroke Howard. These two had been boys together in Virginia when that state still ranked as the chief and most imposing member of the Union, and they still coupled the proud and affectionate adjective old with her name when they spoke of her. In Missouri, a recognized superiority attached to any person who hailed from old Virginia, and this superiority was exalted to supremacy when a person of such nativity could also prove descent from the first families of that great commonwealth. The Howards and Driscolls were of this aristocracy. In their eyes it was a nobility. It had its unwritten laws, and they were as clearly defined and as strict as any that could be found among the printed statutes of the land. The FFV was born a gentleman. His highest duty in life was to watch over that great inheritance and keep it unsmirched. He must keep his honor spotless. Those laws were his chart. His course was marked out on it. If he swerved from it by so much as half a point of the compass, it meant shipwreck to his honor, that is to say, degradation from his rank as a gentleman. These laws required certain things of him which his religion might forbid. Then his religion must yield. The laws could not be relaxed to accommodate religions or anything else. Honor stood first, and the laws defined what it was and wherein it differed in certain details from honor as defined by church creeds and by the social laws and customs of some of the minor divisions of the globe that had got crowded out when the sacred boundaries of Virginia were staked out. If Judge Driscoll was the recognized first citizen of Dawson's Landing, Pembroke Howard was easily its recognized second citizen. He was called the Great Lawyer, an earned title. He and Driscoll were of the same age, a year or two past 60. Although Driscoll was a free-thinker and Howard a strong and determined Presbyterian, their warm intimacy suffered no impairment in consequence. They were men whose opinions were their own property and not subject to revision and amendment, suggestion, or criticism by anybody, even their friends. The day's fishing finished, they came floating downstream in their skiff, talking national politics and other high matters, and presently met a skiff coming up from town with a man in it who said, "I reckon you know one of the new twins gave your nephew a kicking last night, Judge." "Did what?" "Gave him a kicking." The old Judge's lips paled, and his eyes began to flame. He choked with anger for a moment, then he got out what he was trying to say. Well, go on. Give me the details." The man did it. At the finish, the Judge was silent a minute, turning over in his mind the shameful picture of Tom's flight over the footlights. Then he said, as if musing aloud, I don't understand it. I was asleep at home. He didn't wake me. I thought he was competent to manage his affair without my help, I reckon." His face lit up with pride and pleasure at that thought, and he said with a cheery complacency, "I like that. It's the true old blood, hey, Pembroke?" Howard smiled an iron smile and nodded his head approvingly. Then the newsbringer spoke again. "But Tom beat the twin on the trial." The Judge looked at the man wonderingly and said, "The trial? What trial?" "Why, Tom had him up before Judge Robinson for assault and battery." The old man shrank suddenly together like one who has received a death-stroke. Howard sprang for him as he sank forward in a swoon, and took him in his arms, and bedded him on his back in the boat. He sprinkled water in his face and said to the startled visitor, "Go now. Don't let him come to and find you here. You see what an effect your heedless speech has had. You ought to have been more considerate than to blurt out such a cruel piece of slander as that." "I'm right down sorry I did it now, Mr. Howard, and I wouldn't have done it if I'd thought. But it ain't slander. It's perfectly true, just as I told him." He rode away. Presently the old Judge came out of his faint and looked up piteously into the sympathetic face that was bent over him. "Say it ain't true, Pembroke. Tell me it ain't true," he said in a weak voice. There was nothing weak in the deep organ tones that responded. "You know it's a lie as well as I do, old friend. He is of the best blood of the Old Dominion." "God bless you for saying it," said the old gentleman fervently. "Ah, Pembroke, it was such a blow." Howard stayed by his friend and saw him home, and entered the house with him. It was dark and past supper time, but the Judge was not thinking of supper. He was eager to hear the slander refuted from headquarters, and as eager to have Howard hear it too. Tom was sent for, and he came immediately. He was bruised and lame, and was not a happy-looking object. His uncle made him sit down, and said, "We have been hearing about your adventure, Tom, with a handsome lie added for embellishment. Now pulverize that lie to dust. What measures have you taken? How does the thing stand?" Tom answered guilelessly, "It don't stand at all. It's all over. I had him up in court and beat him. Pudd'nhead Wilson defended him, first case he ever had, and lost it. The Judge fined the miserable hound $5 for the assault." Howard and the Judge sprang to their feet with the opening sentence. Why, neither knew. Then they stood gazing vacantly at each other. Howard stood a moment, then sat mournfully down without saying anything. The Judge's wrath began to kindle, and he burst out, "You cur! You scum! You vermin! Do you mean to tell me that blood of my race has suffered a blow and crawled to a court of law about it? Answer me!" Tom's head drooped, and he answered with an eloquent silence. His uncle stared at him with a mixed expression of amazement and shame and incredulity that was sorrowful to see. At last he said, "Which of the twins was it?" "Count Luigi." "You have challenged him?" No," hesitated Tom, turning pale. "You will challenge him tonight. Howard will carry it." Tom began to turn sick and to show it. He turned his hat round and round in his hand. his uncle glowering blacker and blacker upon him as the heavy seconds drifted by. Then at last he began to stammer, and said piteously, "Oh, please, don't ask me to do it, uncle. He is a murderous devil. I never could. I'm afraid of him." Old Driscoll's mouth opened and closed 3 times before he could get it to perform its office. Then he stormed out, "A coward in my family? A Driscoll, a coward? Oh, what have I done to deserve this infamy?" He tottered to his secretary in the corner, repeated that lament again and again in heartbreaking tones, and got out of a drawer a paper, which he slowly tore to bits, scattering the bits absently in his track as he walked up and down the room, still grieving and lamenting. At last he said, "There it is, shreds and fragments once more. My will. Once more you have forced me to disinherit you, you base son of a most noble father. Leave my sight. Go before I spit on you." The young man did not tarry. Then the judge turned to Howard. "You will be my second, old friend?" "Of course." "There is pen and paper. Draft the cartel, and lose no time." "The Count shall have it in his hands in 15 minutes," said Howard. Tom was very heavy-hearted. His appetite was gone with his property and his self-respect. He went out the back way and wandered down the obscure lane grieving, and wondering if any course of future conduct, however discreet and carefully perfected and watched over, could win back his uncle's favor and persuade him to reconstruct once more that generous will which had just gone to ruin before his eyes. He finally concluded that it could. He said to himself that he had accomplished this sort of triumph once already, and that what had been done once could be done again. He would set about it. He would bend every energy to the task, and he would score that triumph once more, cost what it might to his convenience, limit as it might his frivolous and liberty-loving life. "To begin," he says to himself, "I'll square up with the proceeds of my raid, and then gambling has got to be stopped, and stopped short off. It's the worst vice I've got, from my standpoint anyway, because it's the one he can most easily find out through the impatience of my creditors. He thought expensive to have to pay $200 to them for me once. Expensive! That! Why, it cost me the whole of his fortune, but of course he never thought of that. Some people can't think of any but their own side of a case. If he had known how deep I am in now, the will would have gone to pot without waiting for a duel to help. $300. It's a pile, but he'll never hear of it, I'm thankful to say. The minute I've cleared it off, I'm safe, and I'll never touch a card again. Anyway, I won't while he lives, I make oath to that. I'm entering on my last reform, I know it, yes, and I'll win. But after that, if I ever slip again, I'm gone. End of chapter 12.